Good afternoon. Excuse me, please. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the July 6, 2023 special board meeting of the Sunshine Coast Regional District. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 1:35 p.m. and acknowledge that the Sunshine Coast Regional District is within the territory of the Seashelt and Squamish First Nations. So we have an amended agenda before us. Are there any additions to the agenda? No, hearing none. Can I have a motion to adopt the agenda as presented? Director McMahon, seconded by Director Toth. All in favor? Any opposed? No, that's carried. Good. So we have straight to presentations and delegations. So the first presentation will be by Paul Nash, Integrated Sustainability regarding water supply and demand analysis update. So Mr. Nash, please.
Thank you. Let's just make sure that the technology works here. Oh, look at that. Okay. Thank you, Chair Lee. It's great to be here. Yes, my name's Paul Nash. Some of you may know me because I live here on the coast and have been involved in water and wastewater issues in the past here. I'm here today representing Integrated Sustainability. It is an engineering company based in Calgary with offices in Vancouver and elsewhere that is doing this project, and I'm proud to be a part of the engineering team for this project. My function here is not actually as the engineer, it's as the local knowledge, since I live here and know the place, and community integration aspects of the project, of which there are many. So happy to be here presenting today on behalf of the team, and it's been 4 years since we last presented here and 5 years since we started this project. It's amazing. We can all agree there's been a bit of a time warp, but here we are. So the water demand analysis update. All right, it's working, that's great. So just a quick overview there of how this presentation is going to go. It's much faster than my second one about Site B, but a little bit of the history because it began 2 boards ago, right? So I'm not even sure who here was actually on the board in 2018 when we started this. So just one, there we go. So if you have done your homework diligently, you would have actually looked up the board meeting from 2018 where the first water demand analysis was presented. And if you haven't, I'm going to do a quick recap here of what it was, how it works, and then the update. Or what it is, right? It's a water budget. And this whole exercise is rather similar to our financial budgeting exercises that you're all very familiar with. And yes, the gap between supply and demand is no different to the gap between income and spending. And we always wish that the gap was in the direction we want, but in this case, as with financial budgets, it's usually in the other direction. So we want to work out what is the gap between the supply and the demand, and then we can use this for our decision making and planning. And it's a key tool, and when we did this in 2018, it was the first time a serious attempt had been made at a monthly water budget. It all began when? Back in May 24th, 2018, the board adopted this water sourcing policy, and with this particular objective, to maintain supply sufficient water at no further restriction than current stage 2 levels throughout the year. It's a significant statement because the previous objective read something like maintain enough water to get through a 1 in 25 year drought, or maybe a 1 in 10 year drought. It was a 1 in something or other target. And the board of the day adopted this one, which is actually a performance-based target. A rough analogy, it's the equivalent of the fire department being prepared for a fire. They don't know when a fire is going to happen, but they do know what they need to do to fight a house fire, and they know what they need to do to fight a condo fire. They just don't know when it's going to happen. So this particular definition here, it's like, okay, we need to know what we need to do to get through this. We've no idea whether it'll happen next year or in 100 years. So it's a different way of looking at it. A more recent policy, this is from your Community Climate Action Plan. It's interesting that it stated this because it's actually what I've highlighted there is a prelude of what happened, what I'm about to present when I get into the update. But people are clearly thinking about this. So things change. We did this model 5 years ago. Things have changed, and it's interesting that this one here contemplated such change. And it says that policy, determine the impact of temperature, precipitation and ecosystem loss on supply and demand. Now, what we're actually doing here is determining the impact on supply and demand. We're not actually trying to separate it into temperature, precipitation or ecosystem loss. That's a whole other study to try and work out why the changes are happening. The purpose today is what is the change that has happened, how much water do we or don't we have, and what do we do? But trying to determine the causes of it is a whole other exercise, which is not the scope of our study, interesting as it would be. And just at the bottom there, we're not trying to estimate probabilities or return intervals either. That too is a whole other exercise, and these days the climate is changing so fast that historical averages are not... What is it they say for investments? Past performance is no guarantee of future returns? It's something like that. Okay, so we're trying to answer these questions. How long is the drought? Right? How much water are we using? Population growth and how the water grows, that's actually the easiest one of all. The Chapman Creek environmental flow need, a new requirement was put in place in 2017 that changes the game, and it comes first and foremost. Under the Water Sustainability Act, the province has the authority to suspend water licences, water extraction licences, for the health of the creek. So first of all, you've got to meet the EFN, and if you can't, or if you don't, then they can actually suspend your licence. That was really aimed at groundwater licences, but it's a very wide-ranging power. So the creek comes first. It is a part of the water supply. There are other sources that the SCRD has, like Chasta Well and Grey Creek. And the idea was to compare them all, and we called it the supply deficit. The population part is the relatively straightforward part, and nothing much has changed from 2018, so I'm not going to go into it any more today than what you see here. Basically, it's the same growth rate as what had been predicted. Maybe a little bit less. This census growth, I think, was 1.67, and we've used 2. And we'll continue to do so. Important down there, stage 2 water restrictions are modelled as being an immediate 20% decrease. So the day you call it, everybody instantly stops watering their lawns. That's tomorrow, I believe. So today everybody's busy watering the lawns, and tomorrow they stop, etc., etc. So based on the historical data, we just said whatever is the pattern for the month in question, it's 20% reduced when we go to stage 2. And we're not trying to model stage 3 or 4 because the whole point is to avoid them. And I think the SCRD staff have got plenty of experience with what goes on in stage 3 and 4. So the drought period, we defined this as the day when the Chapman Lake weir stops overflowing. On that day, the SCRD starts releasing water from the storage. So that marks the point where the flow over there is no longer enough in the creek to meet the environmental flow needs and the demands of the people. So from that moment on, every extra cubic metre is a withdrawal from storage. Before that, it doesn't matter how much water is flowing over, it's flowing over, and there's not quite unlimited water, but far more water in the creek than what we need. In winter, the creek regularly has million cubic metre days and is typically hundreds of thousands of cubic metres a day. But as you'll see shortly, once the snowmelt finishes, it drops very rapidly. 2015, if you remember that one, a low snowpack and an early snowmelt. Stage 2 restrictions were called on June the 8th. and the water flow stopped happening over the weir on, I think, the 6th. So at the time, it was agreed here for this model that we would set the date as being 1st of May, allowing for some climate change and for it to happen earlier than anyone had seen. We moved that date forward by a month. The end of the drought, you get a big rain and the lake refills, right? Both things. We did see last year where we had rain and the lake didn't refill. So that was the concept, and we modelled that as being the 31st of October, and on the 1st of November, the lake is magically full because it's raining. 184 days of drought. The environmental flow need for Chapman Creek, 200 litres per second, it comes first. Believe it or not, there have been times in winter when this has been invoked. There are some times in February when you've got pretty much everything frozen, very low flow, and it has gone down below this requirement in February, but that's a rarity. I've said here it can't be supplied from groundwater. I should qualify that. It actually can be, but what it can't be supplied with is municipal potable chlorinated groundwater. So you can't use Church Road, which you've got to chlorinate and put into your system to then discharge into Chapman Creek, right? No chlorine into the river. Seashore reclaimed water is an option for supplying EFN, and it would be possible to actually pump out of a local groundwater well directly into the creek. Although if you're doing that, you are quite likely taking out of the creek aquifer in the first place. And just a footnote there, the operational objective is 205 litres a second. This 200 is a not to go below, so it's actually the law, don't go below it. So the idea was a little margin. So for calculation purposes, we work on supplying 205 to allow for some variation. So back in 2018, this was in the report then, we had also modelled water conservation. It was a goal from the We Envision plan of 2011 to achieve a 33% reduction from 2010 levels in the water use. So we worked out what the implications of that were and where we were at the time. It was roughly a 13% reduction, and so we modelled it on being 20. And just for clarification, it's a coincidence that this 20% is the same 20% as what we use for the reduction when you call stage 2. This is a 20% in the overall annual water use. And we can't claim success in water conservation because of water restrictions. So if we were to look at last year and say, gee, last summer and fall, we achieved this 33% water conservation goal, right? Because we'd impose water restrictions and a state of emergency to get people to restrict their water use. The idea of this was that it's through voluntary measures, efficiency, reducing wastage, et cetera, that happens regardless of imposing water restrictions. And in fact, if we do a good job in conserving, it helps to avoid or delay imposing water restrictions. So I've had it said in the past, our water use is down over recent summers because we've restricted it. The idea of this is it's down through efficiency and eliminating waste. Anyway, the deficit there, as modelled at the time, 1.64 million cubic metres for 2025, 2.39 or 2.4 for 2035, and 3.8 million in 2050. A bit more of a detailed version of that. These numbers were not in that report explicitly, but you could get at them if you did enough detective work. Having said that, since I'm the one who did all the data analysis, it's a lot of detective work to arrive at these numbers. The one I've highlighted, the watershed EFN deficit. Right? We have an EFN requirement of 3.3 million cubic metres over this 184-day period, and our model that we developed showed that the watershed supplied 3.1. So we had a deficit of 0.2 million cubic metres that would have to be made up. That is the accountant's version of the story. The real world version of the story is that in the early part of the season, the creek is flowing more than what the EFN is, but not as much as what the people use. So we're diverting from storage. And then later in the season, the creek is way down and we can only supply the EFN from storage. So on a total season end overall budget, 0.2 is a deficit. But the way it played out, we actually needed to allocate 0.9 million cubic metres of storage in Chapman and Edwards Lakes, because when it's needed, August, September, October, right, there is no creek flow. So there's a bit of a wrinkle there in the way the numbers play out. The bottom line is still the same, this overall deficit, but the EFN comes first, and it means you have to have the storage on hand to make it up because you've got nothing else. And the only other source in play at the time for stage 2 was the Chasta well. We assume Grey Creek is not used until you get to stage 3 or 4. So that's the budget, how it was in 2018. This was our model at the time. And those of you who have long enough memories might remember 2012, right? In October of 2012 was the first time the SCRD ever called stage 4 water restrictions. And that is the purple line up there. And flows dipped down very low in late October, and we had stage 4 for a few weeks. That was the first time. So these curves, by the way, is the watershed contribution, not what's been released from storage. It's actually what the watershed is giving on any given day. You might actually call it the natural flow, and that's easier to pronounce. But that's what it is. And then we drew this dotted line as an envelope around the lowest stuff we had seen and said, there is our simple model. We're not trying to do detailed hydrological models here, a simple model for water budgeting purposes. So that's what was agreed upon, and away we went. And so that dotted line, if you multiply the flow in each month by the number of days in a month, you will end up with the number from the previous table of 3.1 million cubic metres for the watershed contribution. All right, so that's what it was, and that's what all the planning has been based on until a week ago. All right, so now, updating it because things have changed, right? The black line 2021, the red line 2022. Right, it looks like the stock market chart during COVID. Significant change, and just to the chair, is it protocol to allow questions during the presentation? I'm happy to, but I don't know if you normally do.
We usually wait till the end, but I could ask the directors, would you like to ask questions during the presentation, or would you like to wait? We're going to wait till the end. Thank you.
Because if we were going to take questions, somebody should ask the question, how can a creek go negative, right? The red line there is negative. Right, a bank balance can go negative, but how can a creek go negative? What is happening at that moment is that when water is being released from Chapman Lake, the creek was actually effectively dry. Then the staff release water from Chapman Lake each day, or it's continuously flowing. And between getting from Chapman Lake down to the intake here, there's a 17-kilometre long channel. And along that journey, there was about 3,000 cubic metres a day of water being lost. We're able to tell from the measurements of the drawdown of the lake and the weir flow and all this sort of thing. That's how we calculate this. So there was, to put it in terms you might be familiar with, there was a tax being extracted on that water, right? Whether you let down 5,000 metres a day or 20,000, 3,000 was being lost to evaporation as it came down the creek channel for several months. So we'd never seen this before. There's a lot of noise on that chart, and we can simplify it a little bit if we change it to a 28-day average, right? It smooths out the curves and it flattens these lines. It shifts things a little bit to the right, but what's important here is to look at where things bottom out. Okay, and you can see from 2012, it bottomed out at about 33,000 cubic metres a day. Then in 2015 at 20,000. 17, 18, 2020, touched around 10,000. And then 22, down there at minus 3,000 for a couple of months. So a dramatic change over the last decade in the drought years. During the wet years, it's wet, it doesn't matter, right? That's why we look at the dry years. So in trying to work out what is the actual watershed contribution for a model year, the game has certainly changed. To use a baseball analogy, we've been thrown a curveball. And how do we try and hit that? Just to backtrack a moment, one of the things on this chart, if you look at where the lines come down from the top left, especially the black one, the yellow one, the red one, it looks like they are following a similar curve. They drop very quickly when the snowmelt ends. Top of this chart is 50,000 cubic metres. 10 days before, the flow was 300,000 cubic metres. It drops very quickly, but it follows the same pattern. And what we can do is collect these separate lines and shuffle them together to the same start date. So this is a trick the hydrologists use, and that was what was suggested here. So we've just moved them all as if they all started on the 1st of May. And look at that, they all line up almost exactly. So this is a characteristic of catchments, that they do that. And then in 2015, where the green line departs, there was a rain event partway down, right? So it just shifted the rest of that recession, that's called, to the right. But if you didn't have a rain event, it just kept on following down and down. And you can see 2018, 2021 and 22 are all pretty much identical. And the dotted line there is what we have used as our model. And I've just drawn it across at 0 rather than negative, for reasons I'll explain later. But the key point, it follows a similar pattern unless you get rain. And what we've seen increasingly is once the drought starts, we don't get rain. And also just the green line for 2015, big rain at the end of August that ended the stage 4. But look at that, by the end of September, it had dropped back down again. And it dropped back down again in early October. So just because you get a rainfall event that brings the creek flow up, does not mean that the watershed is saturated or that the lakes are refilled. It might just mean you're getting flow for a few days or a week. And as the analogy that's been used, and it's a good one, the sponge might still be dry. You get some quick water running off the sponge, the rest of it's dry. And of course, that was a real challenge last year when we had flow here, but the lakes weren't filling up and they were freezing. So anyway, if we move them all to the 1st of May, our nominal start date, they all seem to behave about the same unless you get rain. So what we did was we moved 2022 to the 1st of May. That's the red dotted line there, and the blue dotted line is the same one from the previous slide. And we haven't let it go negative. That actually represents a loss of water released from the dam. The creek itself has gone dry and we're stopping there. Point of that is, if we're supplementing EFN at the intake weir down low here in the creek, that's where the measurement is, 200 litres a second, we need to, it could be dry, and then we have to put over 200 litres a second. Doesn't matter what's happening up in the channel up above, how dry it is, 200 litres a second over the weir, because the lower reach of Chapman Creek, below Chapman Falls, is where the fish are. That's where this environmental flow requirement is applicable. Top of Chapman Falls, it's beautiful there to have flow going over, and the intake weir a bit further up is a convenient point to measure, but the main reason is the fish in the lower reach from Chapman Falls out to the ocean. So we don't go below 0 for our model, but there it is, that is the line, and basically by 2 months after the end of snowmelt, we're at 0. And that's actually what happened last year. 2 months after the end of snowmelt, we're at 0. And just looking at that previous one, 2 months after snowmelt for almost any of those curves, unless it rained, you're down in very low territory. So there's a whole other debate then about why things have changed so much, which for another time. Just putting this back onto the original chart and comparing it to our 2018 model, I regret to say we didn't get it right in 2018. It seemed, for the data we had at the time, and without going into a detailed hydrological analysis, that's what we did. We're still not doing a detailed hydrological analysis here because the answer is pretty obvious. It goes to 0. And as I said before, to work out what the 1 in X year chance of that is, a whole other exercise, but for our purposes, a drought, it goes to 0 within a couple of months, and it can stay there now as long as mid-November. So we've extended that period from 31st of October out to the 15th of November, which is roughly when there was substantial rain. The alpine lakes were still frozen, that's a different story. But for this exercise, that is the period. So, just to summarize all those things, there we go. That's the bottom line that's important. We're at 200 days now of this drought period, and the watershed contribution after 60 days is basically gone. So a few other things for the model that have changed. Population growth hasn't. Town of Gibsons is out. Thank you very much. We have included Church Road, which I guess is getting turned on any day, but for this model we've assumed it is on, and then we've changed the end date. And the lake storage there, 1.77 is the official license capacity. If I analyse these numbers a bit more carefully, I would actually conclude that the effective storage water we get out of it is probably closer to the 1.64, and by the time you take in that evaporative loss, it's even less still. But anyway, it's a minor change. Does not include the use of the siphons. Those are only during stage 4, and of course we're trying to avoid stage 4, so the siphons are not included, never were and still aren't. So how does it play out? Here we go. For our hypothetical drought, between 2018 and 23 models, I've highlighted there the things that have changed significantly, right? EFN requirement's gone up a little because of our longer drought, but look at the watershed contribution, right? It's dropped by an order of magnitude. And the EFN deficit has gone up by an order of magnitude. 3.16 million cubic metres to maintain those environmental flows. And in case you're wondering, why do we have to maintain an environmental flow when potentially the flow was never like this long before any of these water systems were built? It's because we have to. And this has been tested by other municipalities against the Water Sustainability Act. If we have enabled this habitat by supplementing flows in the past, you have to maintain it. It's one of the things about sustainability. You have to sustain it, right? And so it is here. So we can't argue that 300 years ago, the creek used to dry up, so we should let it dry up. We're required to maintain this flow no matter what. So if we build a raw water reservoir tomorrow, the first 1.39 million cubic metres at least has to go to the creek before you can use one drop for the people. So interestingly, in 2018, there was a question, still is, do we need a raw water reservoir at all? So the question now is, if we didn't, where else are you going to get 1.4 million cubic metres from to go into the creek? Supplying water for people can be done from anywhere, and we can suck the Gibson's wells dry, but we can't use it for the creek. So that's an important distinction. So effectively, there has to be a raw water reservoir of at least that size. And our total water supply deficit, 3.5 million cubic metres. So quite a change from how things were. Projecting it out for future years, and we've added 2075 into this. It suddenly doesn't seem that far away, but the real important stuff is the nearer years. But anyway, there we go. For this exercise, we assume that the watershed contribution and environmental flow deficit do not change in time, right? So as we've got it there over the next 50 years, we assume it's the same. It could get worse. Can't go below 0, but the drought could get longer still, but we're not trying to predict that. So we just assume that does not change with time. It is the people and the potable demand that changes with time at this 2% growth rate. And at the current 20%, at the assumed 20% conservation level. Okay, so then we end up there with these net potable deficits and finally the total water supply deficit. So the bottom line there is, if we were going to build a raw water reservoir tomorrow to supply this entire deficit with just the existing sources of Chasta Well and now Church Road, that is how big it has to be. Which is quite sobering. So that is actually it for this presentation. All right, things have gotten drier faster. When the snow melt's done, this creek dries out faster than it ever has for reasons that we can only speculate. But it's happened and is happened and will continue to happen. And so that leaves us with a much larger water deficit to solve. And that, folks, is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nash. So, directors, you're kind of quiet, but I think it's...
I need a drink of water after that.
Perhaps you could quit showing your presentation so I can see the hands.
Yes.
We'll go back if we need them.
There.
Yes, thank you. Director McMahon.
Yes. Oh, well, lots of questions. Did you look at all at how well we have done in meeting our conservation targets? Or is that analysis coming up?
That's a good question. So a quick look, things have not changed that much, but we'll do a more detailed analysis. The real game here was about how the watershed has changed, because that's been the dramatic change. So my quick look is, I think we're still around at that 20% level. We were at 13 when we modelled it the first time, so we've gotten closer. As I said, you can't use the restrictions period to analyse that. The winter consumption is pretty much unchanged, and I might add it's been unchanged for a decade. And the peak day, it was higher in 2005 than it is today, peak day in stage 1 restrictions. So we are doing well. So yes, when we do complete our update and do our report, that will be in there. But for today, I just had to, a quick look, and it's like that's still tracking. And the final one on that, for a really good conservation analysis, that will happen once the universal metering is completed. And then you start to be able to do inventory control and see what is being used and what is being leaked. And it gets very interesting then. So a couple more years before we're at that one.
Thank you. Director Stanford, please.
Thank you. I didn't quite see what the actual reservoir capacity would have to be. I didn't catch that number.
Okay. So I'll just, without bringing it back up, but I can bring it up on my screen here. The minimum reservoir size, if we were only supplying the creek flow need, right? So if we said the reservoir will close that gap and nothing else, my official number is 1.39, but I think in reality it's going to be closer to 1.5 million. And the overall water supply deficit for the 2025 year is 3.5 million, and then it goes up in successive years. So the raw water reservoir, a minimum of 1.5 million to close the creek gap, and that doesn't change with time unless the climate changes more, and 3.5 million for 2025 to close the entire gap.
Thank you. Director Stanford, do you have a follow-up? Okay. Director McMahon, please.
Yes, this is a very hypothetical question, but let's say we went out and we drilled a bunch of wells in various locations and we're able to supply all of our drinking water from wells, and we stopped using Chapman Creek. Would we still be responsible for supplying the EFN?
I can't give you the official answer on that. That's one for the province, but I think my one would be, I think so. Right. As long as the SCRD holds the diversion, the water license there for the creek, it holds the responsibility, so yet you would have to, I think, give that up entirely to force that scenario. That's a really interesting theoretical question. I don't know. I can't give you a definitive answer for that one.
Thank you. Oh, yes, sorry. Director Henderson, I'll hold mine.
All right, thank you, Chair. I just want to anchor, thank you for this. Is the, you said 3 million is in 2025, but we're going to be planning for, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. So did I see, was it 8 million?
3.5 million, total deficit, 3.5 million for 2025, 4.3 for 2035, and 5.6 for 2050.
Which is only 27 years away, or my arithmetic's right.
Yes.
Thank you, I guess.
Thank you. Director McMahon?
If I understand the implications of this correctly, it changes the entire basis for us making decisions for long-term water supply. I mean, that's what I'm thinking, because building enough reservoir capacity for this many millions of liters of water is hugely expensive, and then some of the other very expensive projects possibly become competitive. Would you say that that's possible?
I'd say that you're certainly right on the first count. It changes the game. That's why this analysis is important. It was the basis for decision making, and clearly the landscape here for decision making has changed dramatically. So yes, in terms of looking at other projects, those cards can come into play. They all live or die on their merits. Just using the often talked about one for Clahoman as example, one thing I don't think you could do is use Clahome to solve the creek flow deficit. I doubt you'd be allowed to do an interbasin transfer into Chapman Creek for the EFN. That's a whole different thing again. But otherwise, those sorts of things. I call them the external watersheds. Yeah, those ones can be looked at, and it does change the game of everything. The scale of the problem is dramatic, right? And we start to realise, even Grey Creek at 3,000 cubic metres a day, it suddenly looks very small compared to this problem. So that's why it's that's why the update needed to be done.
Thank you. I'm going to actually ask my question just to make sure I got my head around the whole problem. We've got about 1.6 million cubic meters behind the two dams right now. We do have some water flow behind them and in the creek as well until we get to zero. So after 60 days, you were saying. So if we were taking no potable water out of this, could we even maintain the creek flow?
Not for this model drought scenario, right? So for where we are for this year, might just get through. But for our model drought, where it starts on May the 1st, no. So that's what that analysis showed. We would need another 1.5 million to maintain the creek flow. So another Chapman and Edwards Lake, or a raw water reservoir the same size, just to maintain the flow before we have one drop for the people. Actually, that's not quite true. You've got a drop for the people from the groundwater wells. But from the creek, for this scenario, we are in deficit by 1.5 million to supply the creek's needs.
I was pretty sure that's what you said. Thank you. Director Bax, please.
Yeah, I understand the dire situation. It's and I think the public has to start to understand the absolute urgency of our conservation efforts to start to change our habits around their use of water. I'm just wondering if we can't, I'm looking at the board, if we can't come up with a pilot project for volumetric billing to do some tests as to how we can get people on board with that and encourage them to look at their water use and see it in their paychecks, in their pocketbooks, and if there's something we can do to, as a board, to encourage conservation.
Yeah, I think that's a question for later on. Actually, right now we're just talking about the update for the integrated plan, if I want to call it that. What we do other than that, I think, is a next step thing. Would that be fair?
Yes.
That's not the presentation right now?
No.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Director Stanford?
As I'm trying to get my head around the implications of this, we're looking at Chapman Creek and the impact of climate change on that one creek and potential of, well, we need to look somewhere else. But as a comment, everywhere else is also going to be impacted by the same effects of climate change. And I guess the question would be then, is Chapman Creek unusual in this? Is it the height of the lake, like in terms of elevation, or are other watersheds that we could start looking at be impacted the same way?
It's a great question, and I cannot give a definitive answer because I haven't done a similar exercise on other watersheds, although I'm sure it is being studied as we speak on many other watersheds. For another project I'm doing on Vancouver Island, near the village of Cumberland, the Trent River there dries up more than it ever used to, and a lot of the rivers on eastern Vancouver Island are seeing the same thing. So whether the trend's as dramatic as what we've seen here, that's a good question. I mean, and there are other streams that naturally go to zero, right? Especially if they're facing west. So yes, if you are looking at other streams, chances are that there will be an environmental flow requirement to be maintained on them as part of the Church Road project. The SCRD is now having to maintain an environmental flow, and correct me if I'm wrong, Shane, I believe that is actually coming from the wells. Yeah, so there we are, local groundwater to supplement environmental flow. So yes, the Environmental Flow Need in the Water Sustainability Act was an attempt by the province to play catch-up. Water licensing used to look at the mean annual discharge, but that's pointless if you have huge winter flow and almost no summer flow. So it was an attempt to bring some meaning back into that. You've got to maintain these summer flows. And I suspect any new water license application on any watershed is going to be viewed through that lens, as it should be.
Thank you, Director McMahon.
This question may be slightly out of scope, but since you're here and you've studied other watersheds, our situation of having lake storage that is subalpine and basically frozen up 4 to 6 months of the year, is that unique in the province?
That is a good question. I can't answer whether it is unique, but it's unusual, right? Most of the time the water storages are lower down in the catchment, and certainly most of the time not in provincial parks. Yeah. So if it's not unique, it is certainly unusual, if not rare. And you look at all the water storages for Metro Vancouver, the ones that have been built, Cleveland Dam, etc., they're all lower down, and so too with the ones in the Okanagan. It's unusual. Not unheard of. And other countries, Switzerland, all over the place, right? But here,
Thank you. Director Toth, please.
Thank you, Chair. That's a shockingly large number when we look at the watershed deficit. And, we've talked about the EFN seeking possible reductions or variability to the EFN in the past. So I'm just wondering if any consideration for EFN variability went into this 3.16 million, or if it's something that has been looked at but not presented now, or, thank you.
Short answer is no. We use 200 for the whole period, so it's easy to model a change, whatever it might be, and if it's of a limited duration. So, but no, for this, just 200, 205 is the operational target, I should say.
Yes, I see, and there's no more hands up. I shall take an opportunity to ask the question. The original 28 water supply and demand had considered possible sources as well. When we get your final report, will it look similar to the 2018 one?
I guess I'm going to say it depends. The intention here was just to update the data and a little bit more refining of that. I guess the intention was to issue a memo as an update with the updated numbers rather than redoing an entire thing. But that being said, for considering other sources, we've had discussions with staff and on how you can slice and dice this deficit if you add in this source and not that one. So whether this is the basis for doing that exercise, whether it's included in this report or it becomes a separate thing about looking for options, that's a bit more of a, I'd almost say it's like an administrative thing. Personally, I think it's simpler if the water demand analysis stands as is. Here is the problem, and then different solutions. If you do this, how does it change it? becomes a sort of follow-up exercise, I think is the cleanest way to do this, because this one here marks a point in time. As at today, but based on end of last year's data, here's the landscape. All these options as to doing X, Y, and Z, can and do change, and I think they're better off in a separate report.
So just as a follow-up question, we will get these figures in a table, though similar to what we had originally, rather than just a chart?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So directors, is there any further questions?
Thank you,
Oh,
Chair.
yes.
Yes, Chair.
Director Henderson.
This is daunting and dire, as I guess has been said. It's like we have no water except to provide the EFN. I mean, that's sort of what the arithmetic sounds like. Yes, we have no Chapman. Well, and anyways, so I guess I just want to observe that. That's we got a lot of work to do, and we got to do it now. Thanks.
I believe that's fair comment. I will ask one last question, though, and it kind of, it's a follow-up to 2022 in that we did get through 2022. And we did it with the siphons, of course. Your projection is that it's going to get worse, though, if I have that correct.
That's not quite true. The projection is a blended scenario of an early onset drought, 2015 only worse, and a late finish drought last year. So it's hard to, I'm not actually, what's the likelihood of it happening? We haven't modeled that. But anyway, the whole idea was to be ready for it. If it does happen, if it does get that much worse, here's what it is, right? Because predictions are that it'll get worse. As was said in that climate change report, the amount of change in our summer precipitation has already gone past what climate change models are predicting for 2050 and possibly even for the end of the century. So, who knows? So at this stage, I don't see any need to make the model longer and drier than what it is, if that's what you were getting at. But certainly in terms of worse than what we have experienced, that's what the whole point of this exercise is. And the siphons did save the day last fall. But the intention of this was how do we get, that literally is an emergency measures. How do we get by without using those? Is our intention here for following that original goal of stay in stage 2. What wasn't stated in that goal, but it's implicit because it's the law, is to supply the EFN first and stay in stage 2, right? The policy didn't state that, but you have to do that.
Yes, thank you. Your reply is what I was kind of thinking in my head here. This was confirming. Yes, Director McMahon, please.
Yes. Based on the new analysis, is there data that we should be gathering that maybe we haven't been gathering in the past, do you think?
Well, I've never yet said I don't have, I've never yet said I couldn't use more data. But of course, when you're making decisions, you have to go with what you've got, gaps or otherwise. I'm not, in terms of Chapman Creek, I'm not sure that there really is much more. If the stream monitoring there at the intake is accurate, that is good enough. More accurate data up at the weirs where the water comes out would be helpful, but you can start to see that's really just fiddling around the edges. I think probably the most useful, more accurate data that you'll get is when all the water meters go in, right? And you can start to then identify your leakage and so on. So that's on your demand side. On the supply side, if we had no better data than what we have today, I think that is good enough for moving forward. But it's an interesting question, which I hadn't pondered. If there was anything else I'd like to have, I'll have to think if I can come up with something.
Always lots of statistics. But I like your bottom line approach here myself. Yes, Director Henderson, please.
Thank you, Chair. You know, I guess it sounds a little bit weird, but it seems to me just for the EFN approach, and I appreciate you were speculating, Mr. Nash, but we either increase the height of the dam to hold more water in the lake, to provide more EFNs flow during the dry months, or we get rid of the dam completely, restore it to its natural state, and we don't have a responsibility for EFN.
You're getting in onto what Director McMahon asked before, but not quite. To not have the responsibility for EFN, you've got to not take water from the creek. So it's not just give up the
Understood.
lake, it's give up the
Yes.
intake weir that's down at the bottom.
Yes,
And to
and-
say the SCRD will completely disconnect from Chapman Creek as a water supply source.
Right.
And that's then what
Yes.
would bring in that most interesting conversation.
But it really is. I thank you for, because I didn't get to say that, but that to me, it's kind of ironic. We either increase the dam to have enough flow because we're responsible for the flow, or we abdicate every responsibility for the EFN and we don't take any water for drinking.
That has been done in other parts of the world, where towns, I know towns in Australia have had to disconnect from a creek because creeks dried up.
Yeah.
Right. So,
That,
yeah.
that is a problem I see, though, that if we did disconnect, that creek would dry up. We already, 60 days after. So,
I guess there's a
you
good
were clear.
question for some. I think then we would look to some Indigenous knowledge on did it actually used to dry up historically. Yeah, I don't know. But
yes.
if we weren't doing anything, it would be drying up today. That's for sure.
Thank you. Yes, Director Bax, please.
A follow-up to Director McMahon's question about data. I know that you've that this study is specific to the Chapman Creek and the watershed of the Chapman Creek. Is there other data in other areas, other hydrological studies that we could do for other watersheds on the Sunshine Coast that you think could help us in this pursuit to supply water to our population?
There is probably quite a few streams have had data gathered. Water Survey of Canada used to have stream gauging stations all over the place. The SCRD is doing a study right now on Grey Creek. That's being, as we speak, Grey Creek is being. So data's been collected there, and I guess there was some data collected on Somes. And if you look at other creeks like Rainy River or any of the other larger ones where there's been activity, certainly places like Clahoma and so on, there's already data being gathered. So a lot of the ones of any size have probably been looked at the past. A lot of those stream measurement stations were decommissioned. So you could, but the fundamental problem remains with streams that, you know, in a situation like what we're modelling here, when you need it the most, you have it the least. And it'll be interesting to see for Grey Creek what its study looks like. You know, that one is even more western facing than the Chapman catchment, so it's baking in the sunshine and it might drop off even faster and drier. So it's a big influence.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more questions later, but that was a great introduction to this, and we thank you very much.
Thank you.
I see we're going to see you back later on anyways, so a different subject though. Yes, thank you. I think we need to take a recess here for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and do number 3. Turned it off instead of on. Welcome back to the special board meeting of Thursday, July 6, 2023. We're returning to our agenda at 2:39 p.m. We're going to move to item number 3, which is the Joint Partnership Application Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. And I understand Councillor Rochelle Jones will introduce the team.
I will. So each file, my name is Rochelle Jones. Apologize for our Haywoos and our Haywoos. They had to step out for other engagements, but I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Board of Directors and the SCRD staff for having our team here today. It's a little different to be in your guys' area here, but it's nice. So thank you very much for having us. I'd like to introduce you to our team. They're going to provide you with a presentation, and they're going to do a good job. This is Jasmine Paul. She's our strategic consultant from Castlemaine. This is Sean Maloney. He's our Chief Administrative Officer. And Deb Hensby, she's helping us with our application. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We're really pleased to have you here. Thank you. So, Ms. Paul, I think you're going to start us off, please.
Great, thank you, Chair Lee. I will just share my screen. You can see we have a very short presentation. There we go. All right, so as you can see, this is a photo of the Heidelberg Aggregates mine site looking down onto the inlet. And we're here to talk about a potential opportunity to construct reservoirs or water storage within the Heidelberg mine site on the Sichach Nation lands. So I know you've just received a presentation about the water demand and new analysis is being done. Of course, we have all experienced a significant water shortage over the last number of years. Last year was particularly challenging for our community with a state of emergency going well into the fall. And certainly, unfortunately, it's not getting much better. And we're seeing historic lows again this year. And with that, of course, the Sichach Nation and the Sunshine Coast Regional District, Town of Gibsons, District of Sechelt have been working together to address this important issue to the community and to Sichach Nation members. And we're here to talk about one potential opportunity in that way.
So, good afternoon. We want to skip ahead there. Thanks. So when we would talk about joint action, and what does joint action really mean? And it means for us, we have to consider working closely with our municipal partners in the entire community to ensure that we have water surety, and that's to promote a healthy, vibrant, and sustainable community. And I think everybody is in concert and in sync with that. But not only working together, we can solve this. And we have an opportunity. There's a constellation of opportunity here, and a value-added proposition that provides us with a unique opportunity, and unique in the true sense of the word unique. And so there's some compelling features to the solution we're offering here today. And one of them is that the land that we're looking at utilizing is title hold land by the Sechelt Nation, and it's within the SWIA. And it's been they've been stewards of the land since time immemorial. We have strong working relationships with the local government, with community groups, residents, businesses, and with our provincial and federal partners. We have, importantly, a strong and collaborative working relationship with Heidelberg Materials, who can help provide short and long-term storage solutions with the sand and gravel mine in Sechelt. The SCRD is uniquely positioned to build responsibility for water supply and infrastructure, and also has strong relationships with other government. And so when we look at the land that's available to us, its current and historic burden, and the fact that it's a brownfield development site, there are literally no other spots anywhere along the coast to present the same level of development potential as this.
So we all recognize that urgent action is required by all levels of government, and we each have unique opportunities to contribute to an important solution. And Sechelt Nation has been working with federal government, the provincial government, the SCRD, Town of Gibsons, and District of Sechelt, and has been looking at a variety of options, including through bringing together local governments with the nation to talk through water summits and develop new approaches to addressing the water crisis. The nation is looking at things like putting in place measures to conserve water and capture water, greater monitoring and education to members, because it will require that we do things differently into the future. Members, everybody, citizens, myself, we need to conserve water in new ways, and we need to be thoughtful about the use of our water. We also are looking to take urgent action and complete studies to secure and develop a raw water reservoir and look at a sustainable growth strategy. And of course, we're here to talk about the potential water reservoir.
Right. So we have before us a potential opportunity to use a partially mined out pit that has existing sand and gravel mining operation. And I think we see an image of it there. So what are the benefits, one might ask, from having access to dependable water, at the risk of sounding redundant? So we see long and long-term options. It's available in the near term, and if we turn our attention to it in a collaborative way, we could likely look at finding a part solution for it this year in 2023, 2024. We want to use a precautionary principle, and we use the existing industrial site with no further impacts to important values like biodiversity and recreation. Subject to confirm, there are no small green frogs up there anymore. It's already burdened, and there's little remedial value beyond what it could potentially be used for. The location, it's adjacent to a water treatment plant in the center of the community. We couldn't draw it any better on a map. That's just the case. The collaboration, the fact that we're sitting here today talking about a potential solution on an issue that has plagued the Sunshine Coast in this particular community for many decades is evidence of the fact that we have a solution at our feet. And of course, the quantity, it allows for a great understanding of water storage availability and provides that surety.
There are, of course, some challenges. These are obviously very large projects, and large projects always come with interesting challenges, but there are also opportunities. If we work together at this time, the Sechelt Nation believes, between our federal, provincial counterparts as well as local government, we can make some quick action. But we need to take quick action together. We also need to secure new funding sources. We can't do this alone, unfortunately. And so, of course, that is the work that we are doing right now jointly with the Sunshine Coast Regional District to submit an application to the federal government into a funding source that may allow us to construct some reservoirs. And of course, finally, which you've heard about many times here, is permitting can be a challenge. And we need to work with our provincial and federal counterparts to move the permitting along in a very quick manner if we are to be as successful as we think we can be. We believe the Sechelt Nation believes there's a very substantial opportunity here to make a significant difference for the larger community.
So, what are the next steps? If I was cheeky, I'd say it should rain. But the Sechelt Nation and the SCRD will and has to apply to the federal government for urgent funding to construct the reservoirs. That has to happen, and the time is upon us. We need to undertake additional studies to better understand the opportunity. So it's understanding that there are known unknowns, and it's going to take effort and resources to fully exploit those opportunities. Further, the work of through the Water Summit, which hand on heart has been both very rewarding and productive, I think, for the nation and for all the communities and stakeholders. And I'm pleased and proud that we've been able to attend to that in a very forward-leaning way. And we need additional joint actions on water conservation and sustainability. We need to plan together for a new future, recognizing there are significant challenges from climate change that are likely not to, that are not to deviate in the near future. And we need to do it now. Time is of the essence. So concludes our presentation.
Thank you. That's much appreciated, and it's quite clear. Looks like the hole's already there. We just throw a pump in, right? Not quite. Would you like us to hold questions till the second half, or would you like us to ask questions now?
Whatever works for you, Chair Lee, that's fine.
Staff, would you got a recommendation for us?
Whatever, at the pleasure of the board, you can either ask some questions now, or Manager Walkie can do a brief presentation on the treatment plant upgrades, and you can ask questions altogether at entirely at the board's pleasure.
We'll just keep going then, if you do have time for us to. Okay, thank you very much. Then we'll look at the second half, and then I have questions. I'll write them down. Thank you. So, Manager Walkie, I understand you have a presentation for us as well on the same subject? Okay, can go for it then, please.
I'll get it, don't worry. How do I get rid of that? Thank you, Sash. Thank you, Chair. So if you build a reservoir, we'll have more capacity and have more storage. And if we're not going to go to stage 2, I have to assume we're going to be providing more water from the treatment plant. I think that's a given. So any reservoir constructed will be holding raw water. And that raw water needs to be treated. So it needs to go up to the treatment plant. And we will have the ability, now that we have this more storage sitting there, and if we're only going through stage 2, we need to produce more water from Chapman Treatment Plant. Chapman Treatment Plant currently, right now, is running at about 85% of capacity. If you ever have looked at curves on motors, things like that, the suggestion is to run motors at 65% to 85, 90% of their capacity, not running them at 100% all the time, and not running them at 10%. So we're running the plant at a reasonable capacity right now, but the way we're doing that is by stages, people's reducing their consumption, leaks, all of the things we've talked about. So this was noted again in the 2013 Comprehensive Regional Water Plan. It talked about a treatment plant expansion being in 2020, and along with that discussion in that document, it did talk about 3 options, one of which was an engineered lake to provide more water when the treatment plant was expanded. We'd be seeking 100% funding for this as part of the DMAF in partnership with the Sechelt Nation. So a little bit of background here on Chapman Treatment Plant. When we built it in 2003, we spent $6.4 million to build the treatment plant. And then as Paul, Mr. Nash had noted earlier, soon after we put the treatment plant online, we were seeing consumptions of 26, 27, 28 million liters a day for a week at a time. And you have to remember the treatment plant was designed to produce 25 million liters. We were topping it out. And currently, today we're running at about 21 million liters. And again, that's due to all the work we've done on low flush toilets and everything else that I just mentioned. And so in 2007, we
we were ready to expand the treatment plant already because of these flows. And we had an estimate at that time of a $5.6 million construction cost of just expanding the treatment plant by 50%. And so recently we've had, it's interesting after all these years, the same engineer but for a different company give us an updated estimate on the cost of the treatment plant expansion. And if we did it today, it'll be about $21.5 million. And if we do it, sorry, that says 2021, it should say 2023. In 5 years, when we probably will be building the plant within the next few years kind of thing, the estimate is $25 million to expand the plant so that it can produce 37.5 million liters a day. As part of upgrades, as I'm sure is expected, we'll be increasing the plant by 50%, so you basically have to increase a lot of the things in the plant by at least 50% or upgrade them altogether. Things such as a soda silo. We have, it looks like a big grain silo that we put soda ash in, dry soda ash. That won't be big enough if we increase the plant by 50%. Same as the coagulant storage, same as the ultraviolet treatment. Those units are very expensive and take a lot of hydro to run. All of those things would have to be updated. This is what was proposed in 2007, and if we were to do further engineering, I'm sure it would be very similar to this. To try and make this make sense, the arrows that look like arrows going to the left is a driveway down into the treatment plant. The treatment plant's 3 stories high, so this is looking at it from the top. And you can see the yellow part at the top is what would be built. From my understanding from the update we just had, concrete standards have changed, so it would probably not be right next to the plant, or maybe we would have to pour another wall, but we would have to do that type of construction. But you can see that the whole yellow would have to be built. And so the treatment process at Chapman Treatment Plant is it comes in on the right side of the picture. It goes through a couple tanks where coagulant is added and soda ash is added to adjust the pH. The coagulant sticks all the particles together. It goes through a tank where we put air in it in the 3rd chamber there, and that floats all the solids out and all the color and turbidity comes out of it, turbidity's particles in the water. Then it goes through a filtration, a sand filtration, which is on the very left there, which has anthracite and sand in it. Once it goes down through that filter, it's all ready to have UV disinfection and sodium hypochlorite injection that we're commissioning this week, which is quite exciting. That's a project almost completed. Then it goes into our reservoirs and out into the system. And so this treatment plant feeds water all the way up to Secret Cove, and then the water gets all the way down to Reed Road, where it gets repumped and can make it all the way down to Twin Isles Drive off North Road. So it does the entire regional service area. That was a very short presentation. I just wanted to give you an overview of what we're planning for upgrades to the plant. If we have the ability to draw from more storage, wherever it's from. As I said in the past, in 2007, it was talked about engineered lakes or maybe expanding the lake or other alternatives. And there's, as presented by the Seychelles Nation, there's an option here for this, a storage area that would require a treatment plant upgrade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. I think if you could stop sharing that now so we can see see all the directors here. Yes, Director McMahon, I believe you have a question.
Oh, I have a ton of questions, and I'll be thinking of them in the middle of the night tonight. But and here's an impossible question for staff, but I'll throw it out there. What if we change the goalpost? What if we say we're going to consider stage 3 as our goal rather than stage 2? The reservoirs will hold raw water that can be put in the creek for the EFN, what if we change what we are expecting to produce for human consumption?
Thank you, Chair. Please don't call me tonight. You can wait till tomorrow during the daytime. Whatever we're doing, there's in the drought response plan, we have 7 or 8 items we always look at to see how we determine what stages we're going into, and the weather, the time of year, what snowpack there's left, and one is storage. So if we don't have storage, or we're choosing to use the storage a different way, then we're going to have to go into stages. So you talked about stage 3. If we're saving the storage, like say not in the lake for something else, then we would have to still calculate the storage we have remaining for consumption and what time of year it is, things like that, to determine the stages. As it was brought up in Mr. Nash's presentation, you know, if you make the reservoirs big enough, you can stay in stage 2. If they're smaller than what's being suggested, we have to do something different.
Thank you. Director Stamford, please.
I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself in details here, but one of the things that I heard in the earlier presentation was a massive change in the level of evaporation, and that some of the issues that we're looking at with Chapman is it's due to evaporation. It's western facing, sunny. What we're looking at here is a huge open reservoir in a very sunny, dry area. And I'm wondering if there's thoughts in how that can be mitigated. You know, is there covers being considered? Is that part of plans? Am I getting way too detailed here? But everything that I'm seeing that we're looking at is in that same western area, that same overall western facing, sunny, dry part of the Sunshine Coast. So that's my comment, and hopefully we'll be looking at details to help mitigate that. Thanks.
I don't believe staff would like to take a guess at that one, would they?
I haven't calculated evaporation from raw water reservoirs. Maybe Shishil Nation has, I'm not sure. But we certainly joked about there's some reservoirs down in California that have the little balls that sit on top of them to stop evaporation. I'm sure that will be considered as part of construction.
Yes.
Yeah, Shane just basically answered the question. It is something that's quite important, and we are looking at things like little round balls that sit on top of the water. So they have solved, well, more or less solved this problem in California and other places down south. So we'll be looking at those opportunities as well.
Yes, I was trying to understand what Garden Bay Lake would look like with full of. No, sorry, just my sense of humor. Yes, directors, any? Oh, yes, Manager Waukee.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a comment in. I thought what you were going to ask is that these reservoirs will be filled when there's plenty of water in the creek. I don't know if that's being stated clearly. So we won't be filling them during the summertime. So we'll fill them prior to the summertime when the creek flows are high. And then this water would go into these reservoirs, and let's say there's some evaporation, that would have to be calculated in. But it's not like these reservoirs are taking water from the creek during the low times.
Thank you. Directors, any other questions? I had just one question of permitting. You mentioned permitting. Do we know what kind of permitting we would need? It's not like new water or anything like that. Like, it's just kind of like if we were doing some mining. Is that about it? Or anyways?
Yeah, it's certainly something that we're working with our SERD colleagues on and seeking advice, obviously, from our provincial and federal colleagues as well. So we're just trying to get clear on that. There are a couple of different options, but we're looking for the smartest solution that requires the most logical options in terms of permitting. So we don't have the exact answer for you yet, but that's one of our key tasks right now is to become very clear on that.
Yes, it's been included in the delivery date you've talked about, so we're fairly comfortable. Thank you. Director McMahon, please.
Sure. So if everything went according to plan and we got lots of grant money to pay for this, nonetheless, if I understand this correctly, we are facing increased costs for operating an expanded facility and the reservoirs and so forth. So my residents cannot expect their utility bills not to increase. That's just, would staff say that that is a fair comment?
Yeah, even if we were fortunate enough to receive 100% grant funding as applied for through the DMAF application, that is for the potential reservoirs and the treatment plant upgrades. That would not include the costs, the additional costs of operating the additional infrastructure. Plus, as we're about to find out in the next presentation, there's a number of other projects that we're also working on, all of which will have their own sets of financial implications to ratepayers. One of the potential benefits of the DMAF application at the level of eligibility it is available at is it greatly reduces the amount of borrowing that might be required for the infrastructure, but will not provide any funding for operational costs.
Thank you, staff. I don't see any further questions. It must have been a really good presentation. Thank you very much. Looks like we'll have lots of questions later, but that's after tonight when. So, yeah, Donna says she'll call. Thank you. Thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. So the next item is item number 4, which is Water Supply Conservation Projects update from our CAO, Mr. McKinley, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you so much to members from the nation for the presentation. Have a wonderful afternoon. So thinking about the water supply and demand analysis update we had this morning, I'm reminded of saying that my wife uses often. She's one of her many hats is she's a yoga instructor. And she says, the paths are many, the truth is one. Well, we sure got a truth bomb this morning in that supply and demand analysis. And we just heard about a really potentially exciting opportunity to work together with the nation to address part of the deficit that was dropped on us this morning. And this is the rest of the paths. These are some of the other things we're working on. I know that when I'm at the grocery store or in other places and I'm wearing my SCRD insignia, I'll be often asked, what on earth are you guys doing about water? You're not doing anything. And I know that we do our best for the thousands that are watching live at home, I'm sure, and all the people that crowd our boardrooms every meeting to try and share what it is we're doing about water. For those people that might have the impression that we're not doing anything else, this is for the benefit of the public to say, in addition to everything you just heard, here's a few other things that we're currently working on. So the first one is Church Road Well, and this has certainly been the focus of a tremendous amount of effort and energy. We've been working so hard with the help of our directors doing tremendous lobbying with their provincial counterparts, and the work of the staff from the province of BC, our teams of consultants and staff from SCRD. We finally, around 5 o'clock Friday, June 30th, got the leave to commence to operate the Church Road Well. We were also able to issue substantial completion to the primary contractor for Church Road Well on the 30th as well. That means we are now able to operate the Church Road Well field. After all of this time, we're finally in a position to be able to do that. However, we still have to follow all requirements in the water license we've been given, and one of those requirements is we do have to do compliance monitoring of Soames Creek with the view to setting the final environmental flow needs for that creek, which would be supplemented, as we learned, from the Church Road Well itself. That RFP award report is coming to you later this very afternoon for approval, and if approved, we will be in complete position to turn on Church Road well, which will be really great. Another potential source, Langdale Well. It's probably a few years away yet, but the drilling and testing have been completed, and the drilling has been it's a production-sized drill, or hole that was dug. Our consultant is currently drafting a report summarizing all the results, and that'll be presented to the board in September. Once the project and the province has a chance to review the findings, water license application can be submitted, and we're well underway for conceptual design for the well field and the pump house for Langdale Well. And that's probably going to produce a volume similar or slightly higher than what we're expecting from Church Road. The next one, water meter installations. Most people are aware of this. We were fortunate enough to receive $6 million in grant funding to help out with the costs of this. The RFP has been awarded. Work is already underway to locate all of the water connections. We're expecting some installation work to begin this October, and that's going to begin with the installation of meters at properties that have already had their meter boxes installed. So it's good to know that while this is another project that's taken much longer than we would have liked, it's nice to see work finally underway with some meters actually going into the ground this year. Next one is Grey Creek water treatment upgrades. So Grey Creek, we operate in the summer, can provide up to 2.7 million liters of water today, or per day. We're in our second year of monitoring for the potential of doing major treatment upgrades. We would need support of the nation if we were to look at doing something permanent or major treatment upgrades there. And the 2.7 million liters we get per day out of Grey Creek can fluctuate and go down as the conditions get drier. We also can't use it currently when it rains because that makes the water too turbid. Next one is Chapman siphon system update. So it wasn't included, as you heard, in the water supply and demand analysis because we're currently only able to use the siphons in stage 4, and we have to reapply for permission to continue to use those siphons each year. We have applied for a 2-year extension to the siphons. The Shishel Nation is not opposed to that extension for this year and for next year. Those provide us up to 1.3 million cubic meters of additional water into the system. It wasn't factored into the supply and demand analysis, but clearly what we heard this morning, and a lot more discussion will have to happen with the nation and the province, but what we heard this morning creates a massive gap between the supply we have and the demand we have that may mean that the siphons need to be considered as a more of a permanent solution, not as a temporary solution. Next one, we talked a little bit about this morning earlier, the environmental flow needs. This is the provincial requirement under the Water Sustainability Act, and it's the first thing that needs to be fulfilled before people get a drop, wildlife and fish and the environment gets theirs. So we're required to release a significant amount of water from Chapman Lake for environmental flow needs. It's 200 liters a second. Another way to say that is it's 17.3 million liters per day just for fish. So in stage 2, people use about 18 million liters. Fish get 17.3. So that's 35.3 million liters a day coming out of Chapman and Edwards. Sunshine Coast Regional District has shared information with Shishel Nation for discussion about the proposed amendments to EFN. We're not trying to think of them as reductions. We're more trying to think of them as recalibrating the correct EFN levels at different times of the year. The recommendations that have been developed by our consultant are for recommending a reduction from 200 liters a second to 160 in June and July, and 180 liters in August and September. So that would free up in June and July up to 4 million liters of water a day would remain behind the dam, and in July and August there'd be another 2 million liters of water a day behind the dam. So we submitted an emergency authorization request in June, and we're hoping to hear back from the province in the near future on whether or not we're going to be able to incorporate this as a tool to be used this year. Another project that we're working on is the Eastbourne Water Supply Expansion Project. 3 test wells were drilled and tested earlier this year to similar levels as the deeper well, which is less susceptible to drought than the shallow wells. The aquifers here are layered, with the 3 shallow wells drawing from the top aquifer and the drilled well accessing the lower aquifer. The new drilled wells access the lower aquifer. Staff are going to be presenting a report and presentation to the board with findings and recommendations this July 27th at Committee of the Whole. I've been getting a lot of questions actually about additional groundwater exploration. What are you guys doing about further groundwater exploration? So I'm happy to be able to provide a bit of an update today. The SCRD board has directed staff to explore new potential groundwater sources in the Chapman water system. These would further diversify the water system. And we're coming forward next Thursday, July 13th at COW, following to board with a award report based on that board direction. Gibson's and Sunshine Coast Regional District water system optimization. The purpose of this is to continue to develop healthy relationships between the town of Gibson's, Sunshine Coast Regional District, Squamish Nation, and the province of BC, focused on being effective stewards of our water. It builds on the current bulk water agreement framework and more recent emergency water supply agreements, and it would align the provision of drinking water, protection of the environment, and increase water system resiliency for both the town of Gibson's and the Sunshine Coast Regional District. This is designed to increase reliability for both communities through a review of infrastructure and additional coordination, basically meaning that we're going to find more effective and efficient ways of flowing water between the systems independently. It's going to align strategies and planning goals such as well and aquifer protection strategies, development permit requirements, monitoring and modeling, and emergency response plans, and plan the best use for each water source over the year to align with the drought forecasts and limitations of each source. And Marianne West Park Well. Staff are developing a request for proposal to better understand aquifer connectivity that could support potential future well development. And this is sort of carefully linked to the system optimization with the town of Gibson's. We believe that by demonstrating to the province through better monitoring that they're going to be more, they'll be quicker to approve projects like Marianne West and would be probably more prepared to provide higher volume licensing. And it might even see increases to some existing licenses by working with the town of Gibson's on better data. And those are a few of the other projects. So what else are you guys doing? These are some of those. I'm happy to take any questions. And by me, happy to take any questions, Manager Walkie and his crew.
Thank you, CAO. Directors, do you have any questions? No questions. Wow, this is good. Thank you very much. So we then will move on to item number 5, which is the Site B Reservoir Phase 4 update from Mr. Nash again. If you could come up and tell us good news now. Would you like a few minutes? We could refill our coffee cups. No, you good? Wow.
Okay, raw water reservoir. We've had a few tongue twisters today, but this one is unnecessarily hard if you say it a few times fast. All right. as I did with the water demand analysis, I'll give a little bit of history of it, because once again, it began a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and a lot has changed. A lot has happened since then, and different people here. So part of the presentation is just to catch you up to speed. The last time this saw daylight was November of 2019, with a presentation then at the end of phase 3, and then we dived into phase 4. So this is my little preamble here, because it isn't just about storage. It's an opportunity. And as we go at the end of the presentation, you'll see more on that, but it does actually enable more than just cubic meters of storage, which is good, because you should always look for the co-benefits, and the more co-benefits you get, the better chance you have of not only project success, but getting funding for it in the first place. So it's been and that's the reason why I'm on the project team. The hard engineering is being done by the experienced civil and reservoir engineers elsewhere, but part of my thing was to look at how we can make sure that identify all the value opportunities for this project, and there's quite a few. And as of a week ago, we thought we had it all dialed, right? So, yeah. And I've lived this for the last 5 years, and if you're wondering why you never heard from me before on this project, I was asked to keep a low profile previously, but I'm sort of able to blow my cover here today. But yeah, I live here. I've been following what's going on, and I carry water to my farm during water restrictions, and even I was actually floored when I got to the point of crunching those numbers to come out with the that new environmental flow deficit. Right, very sobering. So it changes the goals for everything, including the raw water reservoir. So just my little preamble here. The original target size, 0.9 to 1.3, was intended to solve the water reservoir from 2025 to 2035 in conjunction with the Church Road well. So we have no hope of getting it built by 2025, and possibly not even 2030. Its goal can and should change. This is the first time that staff have seen these numbers, but I'm just putting it here for argument's sake that one end of the goals anyway, 5.6 million cubic metres to solve the entire deficit as it stands today if you did nothing else, right? If you do all the other things that we just talked about, it chips away at the deficit, but keep in mind the creek flow deficit of 1.5 million cubic metres, reservoir, reclaimed water or groundwater from local within the Chapman Creek aquifer are the only options. So that would be a different objective for the reservoir if it was just EFN, but the idea was both. And obviously a fair amount of money has been spent to date. You wouldn't necessarily know it from this PowerPoint presentation, but there has been a lot, and I had always chewed on, for all the information we've gained, can we do better and now, or bigger, and now we're forced to. So some of what I'm going to present, even the staff haven't seen, a new idea that comes at the end, but that's nothing unusual for them. But the idea is a lot of work's been done, a lot of knowledge there, the goalposts have moved, so how do we apply it? Back when we started, there it was, right, the search constraints, provincial or SCRD land, not that the SCRD owns vast amounts of land, not on the private or the mine lands, and that constraint, 15 metres, is actually a little bit more to that. It's a formula related to the height and the volume of the dam, but anyway, once it's a large dam, it brings in some more rules, and you're registered with the International Commission on Large Dams, and somebody has to go to an annual conference and all sorts of other such things. We found a bunch of sites, narrowed it down to a short list of 4. Right, there's a year's worth of work on one slide. In 2019, we did a whole bunch of work on all 4 sites. I'm narrowing down another year's worth onto one slide here. This was captured in the November 2019 presentation. But anyway, the reason why site B1, largest and easiest to build, but not the cheapest. A couple of the alpine sites we looked at were sort of, they're smaller projects, but other considerations with doing construction in the Alpine. And it offers these operational benefits too, which I'll get into more about later. And there's some other potential environmental benefits there too that you just might never have imagined. So Site B was where it emerged. One of the questions we had been asked at the time, like all of these reservoirs were what you call an off-stream reservoir. We are not damming up the creek. And I had a member of the public ask, why don't you just dam up the creek? It's like, well, that's not that simple. But a dam across the creek to impound the amount of water we need would be huge. And then you need a huge spillway, and on it went. But the creek is relatively steep, so even a 15-metre high dam, it turns out, would only give you a couple of 100,000 cubic metres of storage. Right, so the idea here is an off-stream site, as big as whatever the site can handle, divert to it in winter, use it in the summer. And it sounds counterintuitive, but what you really want is flat land. The flatter the better. And or somewhere where you've got a flat area upstream of a choke point to build a small dam. And that's what the Alpine lakes that we considered were. But Site B was the winner, and that's where our focus was for Phase 4. Wonders of Google Earth, here it is, rough outline there. That's the gun club to the top right, to the right I should say. Area to the top, area of privately owned land that is a gravel mine, a small one, and is permitted as a mine. You can see that's more private land to the west of the road there. The area to the south that is a cut block, that's within the community forest, and there's the remains of a now disused quarry at the bottom left. So surrounded by human activity. The constraints here, a little bit of colour coding. The gas line is not obvious from the previous slide. Oh yeah, it is. You can see the road. We consider that to be an immovable object, even though you can move a gas line if you've got enough money. For this exercise, we just assumed that to be a immovable boundary. You've got the different Crown land areas we're showing there. The gun club at first was determined to be not usable. Nobody wants to go up against the gun club. But our original constraints were don't use that and not the private land there. So, and we had this 15-metre height constraint. So the rough outline I've got there is the best that we could do within all of those constraints. And the environmental one, just a bit more on that. So it certainly isn't pristine, but there is some stuff there. It does impact what may or may not happen, and there's certainly more environmental work to be done in this. So it's not pristine, but it is not a brownfield site on the scale of the mine. When we did this work, the engineers assumed bedrock would be encountered because there's places where you can see it, right? And we didn't then have actually any on-site geotech data. So it just was assumed that, and that required then concrete on the side of the walls, which ended up with $53 million for 1.3 million cubic metres of storage. $41 per cubic metre, and for a comparison, Church Road, for its annual production, what its cost works out at about $11 per cubic metre. So it was 4 times more expensive. Has other advantages, right, but yeah, it feels expensive. So that is the design that we then went to work on for Phase 4 in 2020. Did a whole bunch of stuff. The geophysics, I got the diagram of that coming up in a moment, and you can see the notable gap there between when we submitted for drilling permits and when we got them. That was frustrating, but we're not the only people in the world to ever be waiting for permits. So anyway, we finally got to drill a couple of months ago, and that was good. And it confirmed what we already knew, but you had to get confirmation. And in 2020 there, the reservoirs, the mine site option study, which was done by JDS Mining, so we just had a little bit of involvement with that. But that was then with the mine and the nation. So all of our work then was about Site B. This is what we'd found. Bedrock it's deep. I got a diagram in a moment. Silt, sands and gravels. Who knew that round here you'd find silt, sand and gravel, right? There isn't very good clay that you could use for a dam core in other parts of the Sunshine Coast. There is actually some good sticky clay, but there isn't on this site. And a question that had long been asked about, is there an opportunity there for gravel mining? And that question remains open. There's a gravel mine right to the north, so obviously there's a possibility. From our drilling results, it was like, gee, there's a lot of sand and silt, and basically it remains an open question that would need more work. It's interesting to ask this question because if there was a lot of good resource there, you could do what's been done on the other side of the creek and dig a gravel mine and then fill it with water. That would be a very interesting thing. But for what we've got at the moment, it's like that is questionable at best. The geophysics that was done, I had the good fortune to the local knowledge to go out there and scope the lines and brush through the trees and all this sort of stuff. It's a good way of characterizing a large area quickly. And the red there basically indicates bedrock. And on the left, the elevation scale from 210 meters. So what you're seeing there is the red line on the right diagram. Line number 3 is the east-west line. And just on that right diagram, you can see the contours going up to a little rocky hill at 218 meters elevation. So with this diagram, as you move from left to right, you're moving further away from the rocky hill, and you can see that there's roughly 20 odd meters of depth going across, and then over in the middle it gets deeper. That's an old stream channel. So bedrock is not an issue for construction. It's interesting to speculate if the blue stuff was commercially mineable, then you'd mine it down to the bedrock, right? But more work needs to be done to answer that question. So for now, we assume that we won't be encountering bedrock in the project, and we also assume that there's no gravel worth extracting, and we're back to doing what the reservoir engineers call a balanced cut and fill. You try and dig out as much material as you need to build a wall, and you dig that out from the area that will be flooded. So you dig a small hole, build a wall, and the whole area gets inundated. So there we go. That's just what I just said. A slight few changes because of not needing concrete and so on. And there it is. Apologies that that's too small to see, but the point being a lot of engineering work had been done to arrive at this. And the bottom left, the excavation stockpile, to get the target volume of 1.3 million cubic meters, you actually had to excavate out about 250,000 cubic meters and sit it somewhere. If we didn't excavate that out, then the volume would be 1.05 and a balanced cut and fill. So that's, literally you're digging out a cubic meter and taking it somewhere to create a cubic meter once you're at that point, and it gets expensive. But anyway, that is the final refinement there of the Site B design within those original constraints that were set. I think anything else from here would result in less than 10% changes in any quantity or so on. Unfortunately, what has changed by more than 10% is the cost of doing anything. That's a different story. But in terms of a design, there's the preliminary design ready to go to the next stage. Problem is, the goalposts moved in that time. Right, so the original target was 1.3, and I've just changed that here yesterday to 5.6. So this is a little bit different from what we presented to staff in the Shishalt Nation just a few weeks ago, because the game has changed. The cost there is inflated from our 2019 estimates to current as best we can. And but the cost came down, and so the dollars per cubic meter came down a bit. But there it is. So that is almost the end of the road for that original design. We can't take it any further. But of course it's too small, so it just prompts the question of then what? And this is something that's, I'd had 3 years while we're waiting for a drilling permit to think about how we could build it bigger, whether we wanted to or not, and now we need to look at building it bigger, right? Undersize, within those original site constraints, what's the best that we can do? And we went over that, and it's like actually nothing unless we go higher than 15 metres. That's the only constraint that we can relax and stay within those geographical boundaries that were set. Originally it was desired just to not have a large dam, but a few other municipalities, local governments in BC do have large dams. And South Fork is coming up on its 100th anniversary, right? And I actually had a conference call with the folks at Vernon. The Mackay Reservoir is actually used for reclaimed water up there, and had a good talk with them. It's actually not, from their point of view, it's not that onerous, whether it's higher or lower. You still have to meet all the requirements of the BC Dam Safety Act. So the point of this is there's other municipalities, local governments of similar size that actually have these dams that are large, officially called large. They're not like BC Hydro, but these are all on the Canadian Register of Large Dams. So I guess somebody gets to go to a conference every now and then. And the Souk, where is it? CRD. Souk Lake. Actually, maybe I haven't got it on there. I thought I had. Yeah, thank you. It's hard to see up. Okay, that one was enlarged in 2002. They had a smaller dam and they rebuilt and raised the wall to create a lot more storage, right? 93 million cubic, those are all million cubic metres of storage, right? So 93 million cubic metres is what the CRD holds in Souk Lake. This is why you build large reservoirs. It's so big that you solve the problem beyond question. At least that's the intention, right? Quick anecdote, my hometown of Sydney, Australia, used to, maybe it still does, hold the record for the most water per capita of any city in the world. They hold 3 years worth of storage in their dams. You don't have the benefit of annual snowmelt and stuff like you do here. It's not unusual to go 2.5 years without any recharge at all. So we think we have it tough with my revised demand analysis and a 200-day drought. When you're talking about 800 days, it changes the game. So building large dams is nothing new, but I wanted just to relate it to the scale of similar sized local governments here. So if we relax that constraint only, it can go higher. This is what we could do. Not shown, but that the gun club is just off to the top right there. So this actually maintains a 10-metre boundary from the gun club. So we're within the original site constraints, but we don't have to shape it to stay under 15 metres, and as a result we end up with another 500,000 cubic metres of water. For not much more, and this is a balanced cut and fill, so there's no stockpiles anymore. The wall is the stockpile. And there it is, right? 1.8 million cubic metres, and look at that, for $5 million more you get another 500,000 cubic metres. So the marginal cost of that extra water is pretty cheap. But for the overall project, it's better value than the previous one, but it still looks expensive. So you might see where I'm going, just the fact I've got 2 columns and a bunch of space on the right-hand side. So what about if we use the gun club land? We extend it over to the east. And from those contours, you can see there, we then hit the natural boundary, right? So this is more like classic reservoir engineering where you come up against whatever is the high ground. So there it is. We went sideways. The gun club can do something somewhere else. You can see that's a major wall along the south side. And the crest elevation, 222, the base elevation, 202, and the toe, which is the lowest part of the downstream wall, is actually 25 metres below the top. So it's a 25, actually it might even be 27, it's a high dam, right? On the inside there we have a water depth of 18 metres. And look at that storage, 4.5 million cubic metres, right? So now we're getting somewhere if we're actually trying to solve the problem with a raw water reservoir. And you might then speculate that this sized reservoir plus a few more wells or whatever will do the trick. Okay, so that gets into how you'd slice and dice things. But there we go, extending it sideways from that original footprint. And the idea originally was you could do a phased one, that the previous one was a first phase, and then you'd come along in 20-something years, move the east wall, and expand it. This, by the way, raises the wall 5 metres from the previous one. So you go sideways and you raise it. So you're getting greater water depth, and you've doubled your capacity. So our original idea was to have a reservoir where you could build a small one and then expand it in around 2050 when it reached the water supply deficit. So now, things change. This is what we're looking at. So there we go, onto our table, the comparison. 4.4 million cubic metres, so we're getting close to that target. The cost has doubled, but the storage has quadrupled. And it's getting better. $91 million, right? It is a big project. But perhaps, just to compare, just up the road and ferry ride away, the City of Pale River has just commissioned their wastewater project that has come in at $99.8 million, right? So, and Tofino's wastewater project is in the order of 80 million. It's just regrettable the numbers are getting up like that, but the magnitude of the problem, and if we want a raw water reservoir to solve it, it's a big reservoir. Right? If you don't want a big reservoir, then you have to do something else. So that was the idea here, is what are the options, what are the theoretical possibilities on that site for doing a larger reservoir. So there's that one. But still hasn't closed out the deficit. So the water demand analysis was a curveball. Our original design updated, it's like a bunt. You might get to first base or you might not. This one here, we've definitely made it to first base, but it's not a home run. So what would a home run look like? Well, there we go. We've gone on to the private land to the north, the gravel mine. Okay, so we've now, just to go back, all right, that constraint, the last constraint we hadn't challenged, oh, there's the mouse, I've forgotten about that. The green one up there, avoid private land. If we say, actually, we want to take over that private land, that's what we get. And that private land, by the way, is permitted as a mine and to extract 1 million cubic metres. So if they do that first, you get 1 million cubic metre hole in the ground for free, and then you build this reservoir. So, there's a reason why turning a mine pit into a reservoir is a good idea. You get a pit for free. So within this volume calculation here, storage, 7.9 million cubic metres. It says up there, cut 3.8. That's just the first pass that the reservoir engineer did on this. You actually only need 2.5 to build the wall. But in this case, we just assume that the 1.3 million difference there is from the mine up above, right? So to build it as to this footprint, and assuming the mine has mined out their 1 million already, you get 7.9 million cubic metres. An interesting thing, well, there's a few interesting things about it. Let's get on. Okay, large enough to close out the water deficit, right? Those numbers up the top, the water depth and the embankment volume, as you get, each time we've raised the wall by another 5 metres, as you get deeper, you get more water for the same footprint. The embankment gets, as it gets higher, it gets exponentially bigger in terms of volume. That's why the embankment numbers are coming up. But look at the cost. Right, doing this as a single phase project, not that much more than actually option 2. And the storage calculation has improved dramatically. So from my point of view, this is as close as we're going to get to a home run in terms of something that can solve the problem. How do we actually do something really big enough to solve the problem? There it is. One of the interesting aspects from an environmental point of view, the major environmental impact was phase 1, where you're doing the forest area. Phase 2, you're taking over the gun club, which has already been cleared and disturbed. And phase 3, you're taking over a mine, which is thoroughly disturbed. So the impacts happen at the start, the benefits accrue at the end when you go larger and deeper. That's just the nature of the beast. But 7.6 million cubic metres solves the deficit to 2050 and beyond. A whole bunch of operational benefits of the raw water reservoir at Site B, and the principal one is gravity. You gravity feed to the reservoir, and you gravity feed from the reservoir to the treatment plant. You can eliminate the existing booster pump station entirely. We have an all-gravity system, and that is a wonderful thing. One of the other things then is you would also run the water to the raw water reservoir all the time to supply the treatment plant. You wouldn't go direct from the creek to the plant. For example, in winter, you'd always send it through the reservoir, and it becomes a very large pre-treatment and settling pond. And it would guarantee, or not guarantee, but provide much more consistent water quality to the treatment plant. When in wet weather, the quality coming in can fluctuate by the hour as things happen in the creek, and the operators have to react to that. So with this, it actually makes the operation better. And you can even explore the option of doing pre-treatment, active pre-treatment at the raw water reservoir. But just as a settling pond, let's face it, 7.9 million cubic meters is one hell of a settling pond. Yeah, it gives much better consistent water. We can isolate the creek. That if we can turn the creek off, or in summer there is no water in the creek, but if something happened up there in the creek, a landslide or a fire or whatever, you just turn it off and stay on the reservoir. In fact, you'd even automate that so that if it detects turbidity in the creek, it turns it off. You could also do the reverse. If for some reason something happened in the reservoir, you can turn the reservoir off and use the creek. That would be a much more unusual situation. But you can see the flexibility here in having a raw water reservoir. You can choose to use the creek or not for all the water. You can when it's there, and you can choose to use the reservoir for all the water or not at any time, including in winter, which is actually on the next slide. Oh no, it's there, right? Supply the EFN in winter, which is difficult to do from Chapman Lake in winter, but with the raw water reservoir, easy. The other part of this, to make this one work, it was proposed, still is, to do a new intake. And the optimal location at 300 metres elevation is actually where an old logging road crosses the creek. There used to be a bridge there, and reinstate that logging road as the pipeline route, and it's actually up above the privately owned land and up above any land that is proposed for logging or gravel mining or anything. So we're shrinking the catchment, but that doesn't really matter, because in winter at our catchment point there is a lot of water, and in summer there's no water, right? But what we have done is moved our intake above all the disruptive human activity. Up above that there's still other human activity, hiking, hunting, fishing, flying kites, whatever, but we do not have the industrial type activity. And as was seen, 5 years ago when that area was logged, and it was very concerning. So this is an exercise, rather than trying to control whatever happens in the lower catchment, we move it above and isolate ourselves from the lower catchment. So that is a significant risk minimisation. Some other benefits. Right, supply exclusively at any time, that's great. EFN, I'd already mentioned that. If we have a less than drought scenario, like say this year, we've already had 2 months of normal conditions, right? So if we had the raw water reservoir, we'd be saying, you know, we're going to get through to the end of the season and there'll be water left over. We could choose to release it in the late season for fish flow. Right, so here's a proactive environmental thing that we can do, because we know that over the winter there's enough water to fill the reservoir, whatever size it is, and wherever it is, you can always fill it. So we can make the proactive decision to let the water go, and with the intake at the base of the reservoir, that is nice cold water. Let it go back into the creek, flows over Chapman Falls where it gets highly aerated, and we've got cold aerated water for the fish. So that's an interesting thing there. Houston Creek is, that's not a typo, it is Houston, not Hudson, is actually at the southeast corner of the raw water reservoir at Site B. So we actually build the dam literally just above where the creek starts. And we could actually allocate some of the storage in the dam to provide an environmental flow to that creek, just as is about to be done at Soames Creek. So there's another, if we build it large enough that we have some spare capacity, we can do some intentional environmental improvements. Last one there, you hope not to have to do this, but it would be the largest easily accessible freshwater lake this side of Sackinaw. Right, so if there was a fire in the catchment up above it, this is a great resource that's right there, rather than float planes and helicopters having to scoop salt water, which is what they were doing at Horseshoe Bay last week. And it is actually big enough to land the twin-engine Canadair float plane on it. All right, one of the other things we can do, hydro generation, my favourite. A couple of possibilities here. In line on the pipeline that would run from the reservoir to the treatment plant. The reservoir is now 45 metres above the treatment plant, so we flow by gravity to the treatment plant, and we can do an inline generator, which is what is pictured, and generate hydroelectricity along the way. That is a beautiful thing, and municipalities, if they have enough head to do that, they do that. West Vancouver has a 350 kilowatt system at Eagle Lake, and it's been there for 20 years now. It's great. So interesting. We can do this and generate enough to make it a net zero energy facility. Wonderful. BC Hydro has a net metering program. That's where the 99 kilowatt limit is, and it's actually just the right amount for what would be available there. And you'd even produce enough electricity to be able to turn off the natural gas and use electricity for heat, right? So actually reducing fossil fuel consumption by this. All of this with the water that is in the line coming from the raw water reservoir to the treatment plant every day. The second one, the creek system, I didn't actually put in the diagram of it, but the idea here is we have this intake at 300 metres elevation where the current pipeline crosses the creek at elevation 155, just above Chapman Falls. You could then do, this is a standalone hydro system and a large one, right? Put a powerhouse right there and release the water at the top of Chapman Falls. So we're now actually doing a run-of-the-river hydro system, as there are a few others here on the coast, although they are quite a bit larger. You'd only be able to do this in winter when there's plenty of water, and we looked at the flows there, and there's basically 180 plus days a year when the flows are over 200,000 cubic metres a day. They top out at millions of cubic metres, so we're not interested in how high they are, but they need to be enough. So the idea is that there's plenty of times in winter where there is plenty of water that you could then extract some for hydro without actually having a detriment to the creek itself, and do this. So it becomes a discretionary exercise. District of Lake Country has a 2 megawatt hydro system similar set up to this, and there's a few others in the province that do the same. You won't find them in Alberta because they don't have sides of the mountains to do hydro systems on. But here, if you have a intake and a pipeline and elevation, you've got 3/4 of a hydro system. So that was one of the things we looked at. But the bottom line there, 10 million kilowatt hours per year, it's more than what the SCRD uses for electricity, which is a really interesting place to be. What do you then do with the electricity? It could be sold to the mine. It would require a connection to do that, or it could be sold to BC Hydro. And I don't know if you saw the news article just a couple of weeks ago where the province had said they're going to start looking for independent power projects again for the first time in a decade. So we have the attention of the province right now. This would be a very interesting one to say, hey, have we got something for you? GHGs. So we did an extensive GHG analysis, and I hate to say that part of that's been made irrelevant if that original design is not to be built. So this is very quickly scaling it to the designs that contemplated here, option 2 and 3. All right. So this GHG analysis looked at what it would take to build it, fuel used, land cleared, and that was the major one, is the permanent loss of forest, because forest can act as a carbon sink. And there's not much that can be done about that. So there is a construction GHG impact and operation. If you do the hydro system, it goes negative, which is one of the reasons why you do it. But there is still actually a net impact here. Any federal funding program, you have to do a GHG impact assessment and project out what your project will do to the years 2030 and 2050. So that's a requirement of those, but it's obviously a good thing to do. And I think the SCRD's goal is carbon neutrality by 2050 also. So if you do the hydro course, you get electricity neutrality. Some other long-term improvements. And I've got a diagram coming up on the next page to show what these things are. You could relocate the pipeline that runs across the mine site currently to then join up to the main one under the power lines. Right? It bisects the mine area and it sterilises a lot of gravel that they can't mine. And we've got the residual storage ponds there, which actually sterilise a bit more. You could move those over to the other side of the creek. Why would you want to do that? Because the second part there, in the future, you could move the treatment plant to the other side of the creek too. Don't have to do both, but it's interesting. So the first part, you could move those to the other side of the creek and you'd come down and reconnect to the main line near the airport. And it allows the mine to mine out that pit to its entirety. The eliminate of the booster pump station happens regardless whether you move things or not, but it's one of the improvements. So then in 2040, at the end of life, ore needs expansion, notwithstanding what you just heard a short while ago. Now, the alternative here is if you're going to do the raw water reservoir on this side of the creek, it dominates the future of the system. And one option then is that in the future you'd move the treatment plant to be just below the new raw water reservoir. And there's space there to do that at that quarry site I mentioned earlier. And at that point, all the pipe crossings across the creek are gone. There is no infrastructure left on the mine site except for the pipe that runs along the utility right-of-way, the hydro right-of-way. A whole bunch of things. And then in the future, you could even relocate the waterworks yard from Mason Road out to the new site, keep everyone together and force them to talk to each other. And it's actually at the exact centre of your system for driving distance to anywhere in your distribution system. So, and they're only just up the road from this office too, so even management can keep an eye on them. And collectively there, 5 hectares of land that it's either currently owned by the SCRD or there is rights of way over the nation-owned land. But basically it's 5 hectares of land that can be returned. And the pipeline in particular enables a lot of mining, and eventually when you move the treatment plant, they could do stuff there too. Exactly what and how is up to them, but the idea is you get it all off. And here we go. All right, the left side picture is how it is today. The red dotted lines indicate access, and the blue is pipelines and things. And the one on the right-hand side with the new system and the raw water reservoir there, it's just all there. So we've gone from everything on the left side of the creek to everything on the right-hand side of the creek. And it simplifies the system quite a bit. What can we do with the excess water? Staff haven't seen this slide before, but I couldn't resist putting this one out there. It's a fascinating possibility, right? It's the reverse of the thinking about what to do with the lakes. If you build the reservoir big enough, you could say we don't need them. So it's not an accident that on that previous slide, the 2 dotted lines on the left going up, it says to Edwards Lake and to Chapman's Lake. Those are the helicopter fly routes, right? If you were to build the reservoir large enough to give up in the Alpine Lakes, you wouldn't need to be flying up there. You wouldn't need to be doing all sorts of things. You could restore them to their natural original state, right? Which is an area roughly equal to the raw water reservoir footprint itself. Fascinating concept, right? You can turn them off and just leave them sit there full, but the permanent step would be to decommission the works, and then the SCRD is not in the business of maintaining it. And as fun as the helicopter rides are, they don't get to do that, right? But there's money being spent right now on dam safety improvements, etc. So back to 2 slides. I didn't fit it onto all the map, but just realize those pieces of infrastructure are 17 kilometres away and 1,000 metres elevation. So it's kind of like the moonshot here. If you build the raw water reservoir big enough, right, you don't need those. So That question had never been asked before. It was absolutely outside of my scope, or integrated scope, but not to say I hadn't thought about it. And yeah, while digging potatoes on the farm is when the ideas come about how you could do some of these things. So it's fascinating. One of the objections, and a valid one, about building a very large reservoir right now, we're spending a lot of money for capacity that wouldn't be needed until 30 or 40 or 50 years, so we're spending for future generations. But if we were to build it like this and decommission the lakes, that environmental benefit happens right away. So the environment benefits immediately. Okay, so we're building for ourselves, 5.6 million cubic meters, and then 2 million to decommission the lakes. Fascinating concept. And I do believe that last dot point, Shane's still here, is that correct? As I read it, that was causing you some grief? Last November? Yes. So yeah, if you didn't have to do that, you only need to be up there if you're going hiking or photographing or whatever. Fascinating. Another one, the naturalized lake. My favorite here. The liner. The plastic liner over the whole thing. It is how you do normal containment ponds and prevent seepage, and this is sandy soil and there is seepage, right? It's an expense. It's not like a landfill or a wastewater lagoon liner where the integrity is critical. If water leaks through this liner, we are not contaminating the environment, we are just losing water to the environment. And in fact, that environment, I'm not sure if that's the right number, 556, but literally it's going into the Chapman Creek aquifer, which then runs into Chapman Creek. All right, supplementing EFN without a pipeline. This takes me back to my master's thesis, which was about enhanced recharge from a dam into a groundwater aquifer by building a leaky dam. Right, so instead of fighting nature to stop the seepage, we embrace the seepage. We still want to minimize it, but what happens? It's actually going to be going down and recharging the aquifer on the east side of the creek, and it would eventually show up as environmental flow in the lower creek. I'm not suggesting we'd try and quantify and deduct for it, but just know when we talk about a seepage loss, it's actually not a loss, it's going somewhere useful. But a significant cost saving by not having to line it. You can do a few other things to make it more natural too. The floating islands has been done elsewhere. A few other things, you could create some ponds on the side that stay permanently full. The perimeter fencing, apologies for the typo, but a huge cost to then fence that entire thing. You could just fence it down at the bottom and have a locked gate. And if you wanted to get really innovative, you could put the gun club down at the bottom and use that as your security, right? I get all sorts of ideas while digging on the farm. And the hill there would make a great viewing platform over it. Reservoirs are always fun to look at, even if you're not a geek. The Cleveland Park there in West Vancouver is a beautiful place to go, and so that's a minor recreational opportunity. Glenmore Reservoir in Calgary, where I used to live, you're allowed to go boating on that reservoir. They don't let swimming happen, not because they're worried about water quality, they don't want you to get sucked into the intake. So you can use reservoirs for recreation. I don't know whether you'd really want to do that here, but it'd be nice to have a view of it. But anyway, the naturalized lake saves money. It just means we'd have to actually estimate what that seepage would be and account, like there'd be a deduction in the usable storage for it. There are water licensing implications to a raw water reservoir, regardless of location. Okay, as soon as you're starting to supplement EFN from the reservoir, that's not the waterworks purpose that the current license is for. So technically, you're not allowed to do that, even though you're required by one law to keep the flow going. Some bureaucrat might say this license is for waterworks, not EFN. So yeah, some licensing aspects that are required to be dealt with. And if we say we're going to store, my minimum was 1.5 million for EFN, you'd have a license for that. If we're going to store 3.5 million and decommission the alpine lakes, then there's an EFN license for that. Also, any storage in and of itself needs a license. The hydro system would also need a license then for water power. So there's a separate license again, and the only thing that doesn't is the inline one, because it's already in the line and you're allowed to do that. So the maximum diversion there up the top, 33,000 cubic metres a day, that's for waterworks purpose. If we're filling this reservoir for EFN, then you'd look to increase that. And the way they do it these days would be you can divert, but only when it's X percentage of the creek flow, right? So we want to make sure that we're not drying up the creek even in winter. Those big flows still have an effect of flushing, and you don't want to turn a big flow into a small flow. They still need to happen all the time. So there's licensing rules, whatever way we go. And other permitting stuff too. First Nation archaeology is not a permitting thing, but certainly something that has to be done. And it's certainly an advantage of doing it on a mine is that this sort of stuff was all done long ago in allowing it to be a mine, right? So the mine to the north has gone through some of this sort of stuff for their area, but the main forest area would have to go through all of it. Possibly a federal impact assessment. So there is work to be done, right, before you can know whether we can actually build it. But anyway, that's just part of the process. And the impact assessments, by the way, look at the cumulative impacts and benefits. And the whole thing is to determine whether the project is in the public interest and that the societal benefits outweigh the net environmental negatives, right? And that process has recently been updated, the federal one. It's new and comprehensive, and it's designed to weigh up exactly these sorts of factors. And then lastly, actually not last slide, but anyway, I still really you could do one more expansion to this reservoir. If you were to choose the option of decommissioning the lakes, right, then your usable storage is back to 5.6 million cubic metres. But in the future, you could go and raise the wall one more time. You dig out the remaining area of that permitted mine site and raise the wall another 5 metres is what we've used here. And you get a whole lot more storage. So nothing unusual in designing of earth-filled reservoirs for successive increases, but you have to start out with that goal so that design the final footprint and work backwards. In this case, that gas line on the south side and the Chapman Creek Canyon on the west side, right? We can't go into either of those. So it's effectively a case of design the largest one first within the acceptable constraints and work backwards. And that's effectively what we've done. So the point being, there's still room for future expansions, for future generations to do this if they choose to do so, if it turned out to be a good option. If not, then you don't. But Capital Regional District with Sook, that's exactly what they did. Grant funding alignment, so just using DMAF as an example here. Right, it's quite a specific fund compared to the normal infrastructure fund, but because it's mitigating a disaster, not just treating water or treating wastewater or whatever. So how long does it mitigate the disaster for? It's only a certain amount of time and then it gets oversized. If you're doing a flood dike, you're talking about return intervals and so on. Any federal and provincial funding things, GHG assessments, climate resiliency assessment. How resilient is this to climate change? If we're designing a port, for example, that's a very relevant question. All the co-benefits, right? And we have a few here. Enabling more gravel to be mined on the existing mine site. That's an off-site benefit, but a very interesting one. Right, so you look at the whole big picture here. The return on investment. In this case, if we do the hydro, that gets to be thrown in there too. And of course, if you have to borrow money to build it, then the hydro revenue can pay off part of that loan. So grant funding is my specialty, and I've always put that hat on every time I've looked at this project, and these sorts of things make it a great candidate for grant funding opportunities. And some parts of it, like the hydro, might actually qualify for standalone funding opportunities that occur from time to time, and especially if it was done in partnership with the Shishalt Nation, because there are even more and better opportunities for First Nations owned or partnered hydro projects. Almost done here. You have some policies. I actually even went and read them. Actually, I read them a few years ago, but read them again. Whole idea is to try and align and achieve some of these policies, and the pursue renewable energy. I thought you'd probably never imagine it could be done on this scale, but there it is. Right, so it's in alignment with a whole bunch of your policies, in addition to the water ones. And it's been done before elsewhere. So this is the last slide here. I'll just let you read that, but it's fascinating to see what's been done before. The power of gravity and some forward thinking, right? There's still, I think, one of the Roman aqueducts is still supplying water by gravity to Rome 2,000 years later. And I think the oldest earth-filled dam in the world, I think it's in China, is, anyway, it's hundreds, thousands of years old. Things done well continue to provide value for a long time. It doesn't necessarily mean it provides the capacity, because things need to get larger, but the raw water reservoir, wherever it goes, is going to be there for a long time and can continue to deliver value for a long time. So the idea here was, how can gravity delivers value in and of its own right, and if we site it in the right way, it's expandable to deliver potential future value to future people, or with my example there, potential environmental value to the current environment and by extension the people. So that is the summary there. The original design, it's good, but it just doesn't cut it anymore. We have to adapt, and there's quite a few options, implications for how we would adapt. And that, folks, is the story of Site B. Right? Whether it turns into reality or remains just a story is yet to be decided, but I'd like to think we can all agree it's quite a story. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, that was, leaves lots to think about. I'll have to say that for sure. So we do have some questions. Director McMahon, please.
Yeah, I know that I've struggled with this before. So the environmental flow needs apparently only count below the falls. Like anything for the 17 kilometers above the falls, that can all dry out and we don't care? Is that how it works?
Perhaps more accurately, the province doesn't care. The environmental flow need was set by the fish habitat in the lower reaches of the creek below Chapman Falls. The current regulation says 200 litres a second over the existing intake weir, which is well above Chapman Falls, just because that is the diversion point and the measuring point. So if we wanted it to be really appropriate, you would do a new measuring station, not a diversion weir, just a measuring station just above Chapman Falls, right? And that 200 litres a second over that point would satisfy the environmental needs for the fish downstream. The channel up above, there is no provincial environmental flow requirement. And obviously, if we were to decommission the alpine lakes, or not even decommission them, just say we're not going to use them, right, even for environmental flow purposes, then just how it used to be, it would naturally dry up, as many other creeks do. So it's a steep stream. I don't know if there's fish in there, and that'd have to be studied. There's fish up in Chapman and Edwards Lakes, that has been studied. But the main thing about the environmental flow reach was everywhere from the mouth to the falls. That's where the salmon spawning is, and so that is where the critical habitat is deemed to be.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions? No, doesn't look like it. We're kind of in shock here.
All that work and there's no
sorry,
questions. You're killing me.
Director Stamford has jumped in here.
I think we're just overwhelmed.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering how this fits into the previous proposals for the aquifer that's being proposed at the gravel mine. Is this an addition to, or is this reservoir, sorry.
Yeah.
Is this an addition to, or this is it?
This is contemplated as an entirely separate project, right? So it doesn't mean you couldn't do both, right? But effectively, this is a standalone, and the project as previously presented was a standalone. So the linkage between them is where you have pipes and treatment plant and whatever. But this does not need the mine option to proceed, and the mine option does not need this one to proceed, if that answers the question.
That's just the beginning of the questions. I'll start with that one, that's fine.
Well, yes, Director Bax, please.
Yeah, I like the fact that we're not putting all our eggs into one basket. That's a great thing. But there's a lot of really expensive baskets. What's the timeline on this? I know I saw it in the review, in the report, but the report was quite lengthy.
Yeah, it would be. I think it would be impossible to get this thing built before 2030, right? And probably longer. You know, there is a lot of environmental work to be done. Those studies take time. If we're going to go through the provincial or federal processes, they take time. The engineering part of it, the engineers actually tell me that that part's kind of deterministic and can be done while studies are being done. But the reality is, it's still a big long-term project. I'd call it a decade project. To get it online by 2030 would be amazing. To get it online by 2035, entirely doable if work starts.
Yes.
Follow up for the chair. Will we get a break before 2030?
Yes, I think I don't see any more questions. We're kind of overwhelmed. We'll probably have lots of questions later. There is a full report coming though, right, later on?
Yeah. So this was, you can imagine the what's been going on in recent times here with the change in demand analysis to get to this. So some of this stuff staff haven't even seen, but the bulk of it actually I have. But yes, it'll be turned into a full report, and then where it goes from there, yeah, we'll see. But yeah, it's been a quite a sprint for the last little while.
I did have one question from earlier on. What the heck took the province so long to decide that you could drill a hole in the ground that isn't even a well? Do you have any comments on that one?
I don't. I wasn't involved in that process, but I would like to think if we were putting in that application today that we would get a bit more attention. But yeah, it was painful. And my colleague, Kevin, he actually had to ring up the province and actually several times, but the last time he spoke to somebody, it was like, why should this go onto the top of the pile ahead of whoever else's thing? And I was like, well, it's important. Yeah. So it took time. That was unfortunate and frustrating.
Yeah, thank you. Director Henderson, please. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. In my previous life, about 10 years ago, I very quickly learned the value of gravity. And I want to just compliment, I guess, integrated sustainability. Between that and the green components, GHGs and all the other sustainable features, that points to some real opportunity for funding, which is, of course, hugely important to any of these projects. I guess my question, though, is the concept that could we take this and the proposals for the reservoirs from the Seashell folks, can the application for the DMAF be, I don't know, either or, both? I'm not sure how that part works, so maybe we can wait on that question until later in the agenda.
Yeah, I think we're going to get that answered at the next presentation. Okay, so Director Stanford then, please.
I continue to be concerned about the idea that the new water status report took everyone by surprise so much, and that what can we do as a board to prevent that surprise in another 5 years? And has this been taken into account for looking at this kind of project? It's huge, but is it dependent on what we see today, or is it including an estimated increase in continued drying out in this area. And I do have a quick follow-up comment afterwards.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. Making predictions is really hard, especially when they're about the future. It's easy to predict the past. So we've done the modelling for future growth in the population demand, for the environmental flow needs and the watershed contribution. That model there is setting it to basically be dry for 4 of those 6 months. So how could that change? It could be that the dry period gets even longer, and in the future, instead of the 200 days, we're looking at 220, 230, etc. So it's easy to crunch numbers to answer those questions. It is much harder to try and work out the likelihood of it happening. So it's back to my example of the fire department. They don't know what the likelihood of a house happening is, but they know exactly what they need to fight a fire, if it's a house or if it's some other larger building. So we end up with, and you can see where you start to blur those boundaries, right? How big conservative do we go if we're trying to not build the raw water reservoir at all and do a whole bunch of groundwater wells? Would we be shooting for the equivalent, or would you do them one at a time? So there's a whole bunch of things, but I think for the moment, this is based on, obviously the most up-to-date information we've got. There is room for some further analysis here on the watershed. This was a water budgeting exercise, not a detailed watershed analysis. So if somebody wants to take on, well, why have those flows decreased so much? Evapotranspiration, what's going on? That can be studied, but the reality is we still saw it. So it could get worse. I don't know how much more we can do to try and predict that. You just end up saying it's good to have options on the table that the SCRD might be able to action in the future if it does get worse. So that's there's this part of the supply side beyond the reservoir itself.
Follow up?
Yeah, and just in any public fronting reports that we do, any Site B discussion has to have a few ferries in it. So how many ferries will fit into this is really important.
Gee. Used to be the head of a pin, right? That's, yeah. I don't have a technical answer for that question.
How fast do you want to go?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, Director Gabius, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm assuming that this reservoir project would require upgrades to the water treatment plant. Is that correct?
If, it's the same question, if it's built large enough to supply the treatment plant, so that first one I outlined, 1.8 million cubic metres, could still choose to build that and say we are going to use it for EFN only. Right, so upgrading the treatment plant, as Mr. Walkie pointed out, it depends on what it is. Certainly it gets to a point where the reservoir becomes large enough that you need to expand the treatment plant to feed it. And equally, if you don't do a reservoir, we've got a problem of not feeding the treatment plant. One of the other things that can be done is to turn on groundwater to supply not the treatment plant but the grid. So when you start to have other options, you can balance these things out. So it becomes a part of the future forecasting with the reservoir, different sizes, and the other water options, exactly what happens when. And outside the scope of what I'm doing here today, but it factors in. So what I'd mentioned there was about, in the future, the relocation, contemplating that the plant's at the end of the life. Ideally, if you need an expansion at the end of the life is when to do it. You refit everything and expand, but in this case, that would be the time to move. So if that was the goal, you then might say, okay, what do we do in the meantime to stave off an expansion between now and then using additional groundwater? So it reverses the goal. And all these different options, and of course, sooner or later, you then have to start turning options into decisions. And if you go certain directions, it may close off certain other directions, or it may enable them. So I think it's fair to say, what's been presented here today and all these things has created possibly more questions than answers. The only thing, the intention of these large options was to, how could you answer the problem definitively if you build it that large, notwithstanding the technical, environmental and social exercises to go through that. It solves a bunch of things. But even that brings in other considerations. So they all have to be looked at. And expansion of the treatment plant wasn't part of this, but we did contemplate a larger reservoir needs it and needs extra water licenses, etc.
I think it's safe to say we're confused at a much higher level now anyways. Thank you. Director Henderson.
Thank you, Chair. I actually, picking up on that first, I kind of like the idea between the need for resilience and redundancy. Kind of like, and I don't know if it's feasible, but we would build a new one, but it would be comforting to have the old one as some sort of reserve. So I just plant that as a out of the box thinking. You had suggested, I think this is 5.6 million cubic meters, or I guess seven point something.
Our deficit to 2020, 2050 is 5.6 million cubic meters. The option 3 that we put forward here is 7.6 million cubic meters.
So do we need it to be that big? With
No.
the likes of Langdale or
No.
others?
And if you weren't interested in, if you wanted to keep the alpine lakes, then no,
Right.
it doesn't need to be that big. So the earlier option, option 2, where we went onto the gun club, right, was not that big, but it was almost as expensive. So there's further study here in terms of optimising. You can just imagine within the scope of where we're at. In our original project, in fact, our current scope had said study the current layout and don't change it. Obviously, you have to change it. So we haven't had time or latitude to play around optimising things. So that would be part of the next stage where you'd work out, okay, if we build a reservoir of, for example, 4, 5, 6, 7, you know, what would each one of those look like and what's it cost? And you can start to work out a detailed curve of capacity and cost. And you're trying to find a sweet spot, right? So I intuitively knew that the sweet spot is when you go up to the mine site and you get their 1 million cubic metre hole in the ground for free. Mm-hmm. You could postulate maybe we should do that and not go to the gun club area at all. You know, all sorts of different ways to slice and dice it to try and optimise it. What I've presented here is effectively the extremes. Within that, there may be room for better or cheaper or better value options.
Great. And follow up, if I may?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I think I just encourage this board. I won't name names, but you mentioned the Powell River wastewater treatment plant. They wish they'd started and built it the size they're building now. They wish they'd done that 10 or 15 years ago. So it's a backhanded way of saying, if we're going to do this, we've got to do it big enough and build it right. Don't build it halfway.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you very much. You sure left us lots to think about.
Well,
And
thank you. It's been 5 years to the month since we started work on this project, I think. And I'm happy to actually sort of no longer be the secret agent, be out here to talk about this stuff. And thank you very much for having me. And I think I need a drink of water now.
yeah, I've been waiting the same 5 years, by the way. It's about here how long I've been here. So, yes, waiting with you. Did you want to carry on, or did you want to take a 5-minute break to refill your coffee cup? What would you? 5 minutes. Let's take a 5-minute break, fill up the coffee cups, and go at her again? Okay. Yep. Welcome back to the special board meeting of Thursday, July 6, 2023. It's now 4:44, and we're going to move on to item 6, which is Annex A, pages 3 to 5, and it's the Joint Partnership Application Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and our CAO will introduce this for us, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. Yes, happy to introduce this report, especially after, I feel like the report at this point doesn't need a tremendous amount of additional introduction after all of the information we've received up to this point today. This represents, in many ways, the culmination of the water summits that have occurred between the nation and the local governments on the Sunshine Coast to date, exploring the potential for various projects that we could proceed with together. Timed with an somewhat awkwardly timed grant intake of July 19th for the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. In collaboration with the nation, we've had, I think, 2 or 3 meetings with staff from that fund, with the people that do the evaluations of the applications to ensure that we're applying for eligible items at the appropriate rates. And this report is here for your consideration, and I'm happy to do my best to answer any questions you have, and I have other folks here that are probably better at the technical questions than myself.
Thank you. So, is there any questions? I guess I better get myself back online here. Hang on. Nobody knows who's talking. There. Okay. Yes, Director Bax, please.
I move that we adopt the recommendations as stated on page 4 of Annex A.
I actually believe that's page 3. It was amended agenda.
If
Yes.
it, yeah, okay, I might be reading the wrong agenda. Sorry.
It's page 3.
It's page. Correct.
Yep.
Page 3 of the amended agenda.
Okay, do I have a seconder for that? Yes, Director Toth. Okay, so we have some questions. Director McMahon?
Yes, just feeling a little boggled with all these options that we're looking at now that weren't even on the table a month ago. But, so what is the timeline on this going forward? Because at some point we would know whether we were successful or not. And at that point, we would have to reevaluate again as to where we're going. If the grant was not successful, then we're back to Plan A, or what happens with the first reservoir, the Lower Crown Reservoir?
CAO, please.
Yeah, I'll do my best on this one through the chair, recognizing that our partners from Shishel aren't here to answer the question directly. However, I think what I can say is we know the intake deadline is July 19th. One thing that we probably also unfortunately know about large federal grant funding programs is the announcements are never as fast as you might like. However, there's also a big lag time often between the official announcements that the public are aware of and the approvals in principle that the federal governments will provide to successful recipients under the conditions that they remain confidential. And those often arrive several months ahead of the official announcements. I do not know, nor have I heard from the funders, they anticipate announcements to start in the fall, approvals in principle to start in the fall. One of the challenges on the Lower Crown Reservoir in particular around decision-making time, approval in principle time, is from the nation's perspective, if they were successful in conjunction with local government leaders on the Sunshine Coast lobbying the province for expedited licensing, let's say, to go with the Lower Crown Reservoir, they believe they're in a position to start work as early as this fall with completion as early as next summer. Project eligibility for the grant is tied to all expenditures that occur after the receipt of approval in principle. So let's say approval in principle came in February of 2024. Well, we're probably out for the project on 2024. Like, how are we gonna move forward when we need to start this fall in order to have the reservoir in place for next spring? That would lead potentially to the nation looking at other options, potentially other funding options, to see if there was a way to get advance funding or some other form of funding for Lower Crown if we were to try to get it in place for 2024. If the answer is no, and one of the things we asked the funder is, would they consider reviewing an application and just funding part of it? You know, you asked for X, but we're gonna offer you Y. That's not how this one works. She's all or nothing, and hopefully we'll know one way or the other in a few months. The advantage that we have is working with the nation under the auspices of this particular intake. We're applying for 100% funding on the capital costs. That's pretty awesome. That's typically not what you get. We also have a long time horizon for substantial completion, 2032. That's to our advantage as well. But it's a $1 billion intake. They haven't funded a drought-related project in the DMAF intake or the DMAF program history before. Maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe it's a threat. But if we don't get the grant, yeah, we're right back where we are right now, trying to figure out what to do next with every option on the table, in addition to the other projects that we're already moving forward with.
Follow-up, Director McMahon?
Yes, maybe there is some advantage to being the first drought, you know, getting in line first before all the other people have water crises. So when are we going to see the details of what this grant looks like? Because we haven't seen any details yet. So we look forward to seeing more details.
The report today would enable us to complete the components of the application for submission on the 19th. So I don't know that we'd plan to bring the application to you. We'd plan to, we're applying for upgrades to the treatment plant as described and the 2 raw water reservoirs as described. And there's some financial information in the staff report. That's what if you say yes to those, we will complete the application and get it submitted. It's an electronic application that's word limited in every field. We're trying to butcher together, we're cobbling this together as a joint Word document that gets sent back and forth to everybody so we can make sure that we're putting the right words into the right word limits in the right field so that they can then be inserted into the ridiculous electronic form on the federal government's webpage, where we are not going to make the mistake of applying the final day of the intake when everybody else does it, the system crashes and our application doesn't even get received.
Okay. I don't see any more hands up. Oh, yes, Director Henderson?
Thank you, Chair. I don't think we have any other options for applying. There's no other projects that we're contemplating. Would that be a fair statement?
CAO?
Thank you, through the chair. We examined other potential projects, several. Some were ineligible. So some of the things we looked at were, what if we threw in Langdale Well? What if we applied for system optimization with Gibson's? What if we applied for non-potable water sources for things like Seashelt Arena or Cliff Gilker Park? What if we included water meters for every house on Shell Nation property? We asked all those questions of the funders. They were all things we considered. Looking at Langdale Well, for example, adding that to the size of the application at 100% funding with the nation would add another $40 or $50 million to the grant at 40 cents on the dollar, because the Langdale Well's a municipal project. Things like Cliff Gilker and Sunshine Coast Arena that we thought might be compelling because of the social benefits to converting those to non-potable water were deemed ineligible for the grant. Interestingly, water meters at every nation residence ineligible for disaster mitigation. And so those were, we examined a number of potential projects. Those were the ones that were both eligible and agreed to by all the parties to apply for. The other one that was Interestingly, ineligible was the potential for the dry stack to deal with sedimentation.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no further hands up, I shall call a question. Everybody in favor? All those in favor? Any opposed? Oh, sorry, yes. Director White was in favor. Thank you, that passes. So we will move into item number 7, which is page 6 to 8 of your agenda, of the amended agenda, and it's compliance monitoring for Church Road Wellfield and Grantham's Landing Water Treatment Plant, 2337005 contract award. And our capital projects engineer will introduce that, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. As our CEO mentioned earlier, it's for the Church Road Well Field Monitoring Project. And we are planning to, staff is recommending to award this contract to ISL Engineering for the amount of $250,000, which is $50,000 contingency included. And staff recommend the board to approve and recommend this contract to awarded to ESL Engineering. Thanks.
Thank you. Directors, oh, I see we have some questions already. Director Bax, please.
Yeah, I understand that this is something that the province has asked us to do. I was wondering if there's any funding available to cover any of these costs from the province.
CAO, please.
Yeah, thank you for the question through the chair. No, this would be considered part of the operational costs of running the well, and there's no grant funding programs that provide those types of costs. So we looked at this. We don't have the horsepower to do this internally. I mean, we might have some expertise internally, but they're on other projects. So this is a requirement of being able to operate the well. This becomes by default the very final step, the very final hurdle to Church Road Well becoming operational.
Thank you. Director McMahon, please.
Right, and just, so the 2 years, if I remember correctly, we have more monitoring requirements for the 2 years, and then the monitoring requirements will decrease. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's the case. After 2 years, we will provide a comprehensive report to the province, and they will either decide no further monitoring is required, or they might ask for more monitoring. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Director Bax, you have another question?
I would like to move the recommendations on page 6 and be the one who actually starts the Church Road well.
Thank you.
That's been seconded by Director McMahon. Is there any further discussions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Yes, I see Director White as well. Thank you. Any opposed? I don't see any opposed, so that passes. Thank you very much. So that, we have no communications, we have no motions, we have no in-camera. So I would like a motion to adjourn, please. Director Gabius, seconded by Director McMahon. All those in favor? Okay, now question time. We shall. Is there any questions from the gallery? No, I don't see any questions from the gallery. Is there anybody in the virtual gallery that would like to ask a question? No, oh, yes. Coast reporter, I believe that's Connie. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson Lee. Just looking to reconfirm that substantial completion on the Church Road project has been signed off.
CAO.
Thank you for the question through the chair. We have provided notice of substantial completion to the primary contractor. I'm not sure if they've, oh, yes, I've just been told they have signed it off as well. So it has been both provided and signed off.
Thank you, that's good news. Another question? Connie, did you have further question?
No, I do not. Thank you very much for that.
That's good news, eh? Yes, thank
Yes.
you. Okay, so I think that concludes our proceedings. So, thank you, everybody. It was a good day. We got lots done.